I'd like to call the hearing to order this morning, and we certainly appreciate our witnesses that will be with us today. I think we have two panels, and I'll introduce the first panel in just a minute. But the title of today's hearing is American Energy Security and Innovation, the Role of Regulators and Grid Operators in Meeting Natural Gas and Electric Coordination Challenges. And I noticed the clock says 20 till 10. It's actually 10 o'clock, so that's why we're starting right now. But I want to welcome all of you here today. As you know, EPA recently announced that they were going to delay the finalizing of the rule on greenhouse gas regulation of the new power plants. And I'm delighted that they made that decision. I know that one of the reasons they're doing it is they want to buttress their legal case. And all of us, we have many witnesses who will be testifying today about the increased use of natural gas, which is coming about for a number of different reasons. One, of course, gas prices are very low right now. And a second reason is that the regulatory decisions coming out of EPA make it extremely difficult to use. And if they do realize that gas on for coal power plants, you will not be able to build a new coal power plant in America. And those kinds of decisions, whether they're price decisions or regulatory decisions, have tremendous impact on the way we produce electricity in America. And it's certainly generating from natural many benefits, especially given that domestic supplies are increasing, our current prices are relatively low. But we're learning that there are some very real challenges to integrating more natural gas into the power sector. We're pleased, as I said, to have an excellent slate of witnesses today who will discuss some of these challenges and describe for us how they are meeting them to ensure the continued supply of affordable and reliable electricity. At the heart of the issue is the fact that electricity is a 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week, 365-day-a-year business with daily and hourly changes in supply and demand. This complexity poses challenges to grid owners and operators incorporating more natural gas-fired generation into their system. Greater coordination among the natural gas and electric industries is needed to ensure that these challenges can be met. One challenge is there are certain physical constraints, such as whether current natural gas pipeline and storage infrastructure will be adequate to deliver increasing amounts of natural gas to power plants, but there also are market and regulatory challenges in some regions, such as scheduling natural gas supplies to match up with electricity needs. Many of these challenges are state and regional issues as well as federal ones, which is why we will hear from those representing these levels of government today. The challenges of heavier reliance on natural gas-fired generation have been highlighted by recent cold spells. Electricity demand goes up when the temperature goes down, but so does demand for natural gas to meet the heating needs of residential customers. As a result, regions with a high proportion of natural gas-fired generation see a dual burden on supplies during periods of unusually cold weather. We need to take steps to ensure that the lights stay on at an affordable rate through cold snaps as well as other occasional but inevitable events that put a strain on the system. America's newfound abundance of natural gas is a blessing and should play an important role in contributing to our energy needs, but we need to take steps to properly integrate. And I think the fact that FERC has had 5 technical hearings on these kinds of issues within the last year illustrates the importance of the issue, and I know they have more conferences scheduled on this as well. So with that, I yield back the balance of my time. Recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Rush, for a 5-minute opening statement.
I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding today's hearing, which is part 2 on the diversification of the nation's electricity supply, and will focus on the role of regulators and grid operators in meeting natural gas and electric coordination challenges. As we discussed in the first hearing on electric diversification, we know that in 1993, coal was responsible for 50% of the electric generation in the U.S., while natural gas accounted for less than 15%. However, the Energy Information Administration reports that in 2012, there was a shift in electricity generation away from coal-fired generation, which declined by 12.5%, and towards cleaner sources of electricity, including natural gas, which increased by 21%. In today's hearing, we will hear from federal and state regulators, as well as electric grid operators, about the challenges resulting from this shift to natural gas from coal-fired plants in electricity generation. We will also hear from two of the FERC commissioners on whether grid operators are prepared for reliability issues stemming from the power sector's shift from coal to natural gas. And we will discuss solutions to better coordinate between the two industries through communication and scheduling alignments to make sure grid operators have enough backup generating capacity when gas supplies are tight. Last August, FERC held 5 regional technical conferences where natural gas and electric interdependence issues such as better communication, structures, and reliability issues were discussed. I understand Commissioners Moeller and LaFleur also participated in a technical conference last month to discuss both regional and national issues as they relate to natural gas and electricity markets. While there were regional differences in regards to gas electric coordination issues that was brought up at these conferences, work is now being done by regional grid operators to improve information sharing among the grid operators, natural gas pipelines, and electricity generators. I understand that another technical conference is scheduled for next month in April, where the discussion will focus on whether there should be more coordination between the natural gas and electric industry market schedules in order to achieve greater efficiency for both industries. Mr. Chairman, it is important to note that this shift from older, dirtier, coal-fired plants to natural gas in supplying the nation's electricity demand is due more to market realities than to EPA rules, such as the mercury and air toxics rules and the new source performance schedules. According to CRS, and I quote, "The primary impact of many of the rules will largely be on coal-fired plants more than 40 years old that have not, until now, installed state-of-the-art pollution controls. Many of these plants are inefficient and are being replaced by more efficient combined cycle natural gas plants, a development likely to be encouraged if the price of competing fuel, natural gas, continues to be low almost regardless of the EPA's rules." So, Mr. Chairman, I look forward to today's hearing. I look forward to today's witnesses on the challenges and opportunities of shifting from coal to natural gas in the nation's electricity generation portfolio. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Rush. At this time, I recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Barton, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I won't use that 5 minutes. I want to take a little bit of my time to welcome a witness from the second panel, Mr. Barry Smitherman. He is the chairman of the Texas Railroad Commission. That's an elected position in Texas, and I was proud to vote for him this past November. He's you remember that when I come to you for a favor later on. But he's going to testify about what's happening in Texas. We're very proud in our home state that alternative energy, wind power and nuclear power, if you want to consider nuclear as an alternative, is about 20% of our supply for electricity. We have about 50% generated by natural gas, which is the main focus of your hearing today, Mr. Chairman. And the rest of the country is beginning to come to where Texas has always been, large on natural gas. But we also have about 30% of coal power, which I know you're very supportive of, Mr. Chairman. This should be a good hearing, and we're glad to have our FERC chairman and one of the FERC commissioners. And I hope that we have a productive hearing. I've still got a lot of time. I'd be happy to yield if somebody else wants to use some of my time.
Does anyone want the balance of Mr. Barton's time?
Would Mr. Olson like to say some nice things?
From Texas, I'd like to join his comments, and I voted for you too, Barry. Good vote. You're doing a great job for our state. Thank you very much, Joe.
I will say that before Mr. Smitherman was elected chairman of the Railroad Commission, he was appointed chairman of the Public Utility Commission. So he's been double-hatted in Texas and is really an expert. With that, Mr. Chairman, I
Recognize from California, Mr. Waxman, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Smitherman. I just didn't have a chance to vote for you. Today, the subcommittee hears from electricity regulators and grid operators about America's evolving electricity generation portfolio. There's no question that a significant transition is underway. Renewable energy policies are paying off. We've doubled our capacity to generate renewable electricity from wind and solar in just 4 years. This has cut pollution and invigorated clean energy manufacturing. Last year, for the first time, wind power added more electricity generation capacity than any other resource. Nearly half of all new generation capacity came from wind. Cheap natural gas is also helping to transform our electricity sector. This market reality is causing some utilities to retire their oldest, dirtiest, and least efficient coal plants. And new coal plants are simply not cost-effective to build today. These changes are positive developments. Until carbon capture technologies are developed, burning coal will continue to emit dangerous pollution. We should avoid investments in infrastructure that will lock in the worst impacts of climate change or create stranded investments that must be shut down before they've served their useful life. But these changes also create challenges for our electricity grid. Clean, renewable energy sources like wind and solar provide power when the wind is blowing or the sun is shining, but not at other times. We need dispatchable generation that can be integrated into the grid with these intermittent supplies. That's a planning, funding, and construction challenge. We also need to be developing and deploying power storage systems that can accommodate increasing generation from renewable sources. EPA, the Department of Energy, and the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission are working to answer these challenges. But we in Congress could help by crafting sensible energy legislation. 2 weeks ago, we heard from executives from some of the biggest utilities in the country. Entergy, AEP, Xcel operate in different parts of the country with different fuel portfolios, but they all agreed that the best way to respond to climate change is through legislation from Congress. When utilities tell us they are looking for regulatory certainty, they are not talking about bills that delay action. They are looking for real action and thoughtful policies. They want Congress to establish the rules of the road so that they can plan and invest for the future. Ideally, this committee will enact a responsible energy policy that recognizes the reality of climate change. But as the President said in his State of the Union address, he will act if we don't. And I think he better act before we fail, because the chances are we won't act even though I hope we will. EPA's proposed carbon pollution standard for new power plants is a good first step. It's a standard that requires new power plants, whether they use coal or natural gas, to keep their pollution below a specified level. The proposed standards provide incentives for the deployment of carbon capture and sequestration technologies, and it creates a level playing field for fossil fuel-fired generation. It was valuable to hear from electric utilities at the last hearing, and I'm glad that we're hearing from grid operators and regulators today. They have important perspectives. But since policies that respond to climate change are a major focus of the statements and questions at these hearings, we also need to hear from the scientists and technical experts who can inform the subcommittee about the dangers of man-made climate change and the closing window for effective action. 2 weeks ago, I made that request at the last hearing. Last week, Mr. Rush and I sent a letter reiterating that request for an additional hearing. Mr. Chairman, I urge you to respect this moral imperative and listen to all sides of the issue. I thank the witnesses for being here, and I look forward to today's testimony. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Waxman. That concludes today's opening statements, and so at this time I'll introduce our first panel of witnesses. We have with us this morning Mr. Philip, who's the Commissioner of the Federal Energy Commission. We're delighted with us again. And so LaFleur, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. Thank both of you for being here. We do look forward to your testimony and your expertise in this area. Call on each of you, reckon you for 5 minutes, and there's a little box on the table that, if it works, it'll turn red when your 5 minutes is up. And I'm sure I won't cut you off, but at least you'll notice that the red light's on. So at this time, Mr. Moeller, I'll recognize you for 5 minutes, and we look forward to your opening statement.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Ranking Member Rush, Chairman Emeritus Waxman, and Barton, thank you for the chance to testify today. My name's Phil Moeller. I'm one of 5 sitting commissioners, and I thank you for your attention to this issue because I think it's one of the more pressing issues in our country. The convergence of the electric industry and the natural gas industry is a result of several factors. It's kind of a good problem to have. It just has to be managed as 2 very different industries converge in a way that we want to make sure that we maintain the reliability of the natural gas supply and production, and of course the electricity supply and production as well. I always have to point out the most efficient use of natural gas, of course, is direct usage, space heat and water heat. But the fact remains that we are in a major trend pattern right now where we're using more gas to make electricity. I ascribe 5 reasons for it. First, it's usually easier to site, build, and finance a gas plant than other alternatives. Secondly, oftentimes electric transmission is a cheaper alternative for consumers, but it is so hard to build electric transmission in this country that oftentimes utilities build a generating plant instead. The third reason, alluded to earlier, we have an abundance of renewable power that's been entering the grid, but it's intermittent in nature. It's not always there. You need something to back it up, to firm it up. That's almost always a gas plant because of its ability to respond quickly. The fourth reason, of course, also alluded to earlier, is a suite of environmental regulations, air regulations by the EPA that is resulting in the shutdown and the retrofitting of thousands of megawatts of coal plants in this country. And the fifth reason is that we appear to have a long-term period of moderate to low prices of natural gas. That's coming domestically quite amazingly only in the last 5 or 6 years because of the new technologies of horizontal drilling and hydrofracking that have allowed us to access these resources that we didn't really even know we had 5 or 6 years ago. I was honored and privileged to sit on the coordinating subcommittee of the National Petroleum Council, and they put out a 2-year study about 1.5 years ago called Prudent Development. I brought the summary along today. It outlines just the enormous resources we have in North America on oil and gas. Again, ones that we didn't even realize we had a few years ago. Now, we as a society may decide to restrict the use of some of these new technologies. That won't be our decision,
But if we don't do that, or even if we do to some extent, technology will only allow us to find more of these resources, perhaps extract them, and absent a big change, we appear to have a long-term period of stability of gas in this country, and that leads to the fact that we'll probably have low to moderate prices for a relatively long time. Well, even despite this, we've had some challenges in our country where at times there essentially hasn't been enough gas to go around, usually in a cold weather event. My colleague, Commissioner LaFleur, experienced it firsthand in 2004 in New England. A few other examples include some rolling blackouts around Denver in 2006, almost a near catastrophe in my home of the Pacific Northwest in December of 2009, when some quick action averted a lot of outages. But the event that really brought my attention to this issue was the Southwest outage of February 2011, where over 3 million people in Texas and over 50,000 gas consumers in Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona lost service. It was a cold weather event, but it wasn't unprecedented. And we had problems essentially on the gas side to deliver electricity, and then failure on the electricity side to deliver gas. Again, our staff at FERC and also the North American Electric Reliability Corporation put out a great report on that outage that describes the industries in quite good detail as a primer, what happened, recommendations for it. So there was failure to communicate, really, in that event. And I was concerned going into the last couple winters that because of those failures to communicate, we could have a repeat episode if we had some really cold weather. Now, in reality, we had pretty warm winters the last couple years, but I'm concerned that the system hasn't been stressed under this new regime of moving toward more gas to make electricity in addition to the traditional uses of gas. So about a year ago, I put out a series of questions to the public asking where we should go on this. My colleague, Commissioner LaFleur, added some, and our chairman gave it a docket number. It's been a public proceeding. Our chairman has dedicated enormous staff resources to trying to deal with this issue. And as you alluded to, Mr. Chairman, we've had a series of 5 technical conferences regionally based in August, another one last month, another one next month, another one in May, where we're looking at the short-term communication issues so that if we have another cold winter event next winter, that people can talk to each other, medium-term issues of getting the markets aligned correctly, and longer-term issues of making sure we have the right market rules, financial rules, and environmental rules to get more infrastructure built in this country to deal with the long-term issue of enough pipe and supply to customers. Again, thank you for giving this issue the attention it's giving. That helps us along. I'm not sure where we're going on this, but I'd be happy to answer any questions when appropriate.
Thank you, Mr. Moeller. And Ms. LaFleur, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chairman Whitfield, Ranking Member Rush, and thank you, and Phil, and the members of the subcommittee. I appreciate your holding this hearing and the opportunity to testify. Since July 2010, I've served as a commissioner of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. Earlier in my career, I had the privilege of serving electric and natural gas customers in New England and upstate New York. That experience taught me firsthand how important reliability is to customers and real communities. Since joining the Commission, I've made reliability and grid security my top priorities. As everyone has said, our nation is experiencing a substantial growth in the use of natural gas to generate electricity. In the past 15 years, gas use for generation has increased at the rate of 6% per year, but in the past 3 years, it's accelerated to 10% per year, more gas being used for electricity. There are several reasons for this. The primary one is the increased availability and affordability of domestic natural gas, which is leading to sharply lower gas prices. In addition, natural gas is the cleanest burning fossil fuel, making it an attractive option for new generation and for repowering generation that's uneconomic to retrofit for new environmental regulations. Finally, the flexible operating characteristics of natural gas work well with the nation's growing fleet of renewable resources. This steady growth in natural gas for generation has led to concerns about the interdependence of the gas and electric markets. Because natural gas is generally delivered in a pipeline network rather than stored on site like other generating fuels, it's important that we have both an adequate network of pipelines and operating practices to support reliability. At the technical conferences we held last summer in 5 regions of the country, we heard about 2 basic issues. The first is infrastructure, making sure we have enough pipelines in the right places to support both electric and gas reliability. It's not a supply issue. We have plenty of gas. It's a pipeline issue. In some places, the pipelines are constrained in specific regions or localities. Since deregulation of the gas network by the Congress several decades ago, pipelines have been permitted by FERC based on long-term commitments for firm supply, and that system has worked well. We've permitted 10,000 miles of gas pipelines in the last decade. However, in regions with competitive electric markets, gas generators often don't enter into long-term firm contracts, but instead rely on interruptible contracts or buying gas that's resold by others with firm contracts. This can lead to shortage of gas at stress times, particularly in the winter heating season in certain regions, most notably New England. At the conferences, we received a strong message, really, folks across the country, that the need for infrastructure is a regional issue that varies by geography, the existing lines, fuel mix, and the structure of the market. Many regions, particularly the Mid-Atlantic, the South, and the West, didn't identify a systemic problem with getting infrastructure built at this time. So the conference participants urged FERC to work with the regions on their issues rather than impose a national solution. And on the infrastructure issue, that's what we've been doing. The operators of the markets, you'll hear from a little later, are working under our jurisdiction to make sure that their market rules and their detailed operating rules support reliable electricity. In particular, ISO New England is working on both short-term and long-term enhancements to better ensure that it builds fuel security into its generation markets. We've already approved some market rules for this winter. Second basic issue is operations, making sure that we coordinate the use of the pipelines we have to make sure that we get the best use of the infrastructure that's in place. As has already been mentioned, we had a tech conference on communications, and we're working on next steps, and have one coming up on scheduling to make sure the gas and electric days work together to promote getting the most value from the pipelines we have in place. We're getting quarterly reports on this and in-person reports from all the regions at our open meetings so we can follow it closely. This issue of gas-electric interdependence is not a reason to panic, but it's absolutely a reason to plan, and do so now. Viewed in the larger perspective, it's a byproduct of an American success story, which is the growth of domestic natural gas resources. The nation's generation fleet has historically experienced large turnovers in fuel mix and large building cycles, and they inevitably require adaptations of supporting infrastructure and operations. I believe with diligent and timely effort, we can make this adaptation as well, and I pledge to use the authority I have at FERC to be proactive in meeting the challenge. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Well, thank you, Commissioner LaFleur, and we appreciate both of you for giving your statements. Last year, we had a hearing before this subcommittee, and FERC at that time talked about the importance of coordination between EPA and DOE and other agencies regarding reliability issues. And we've had EPA before us on many occasions talking about, because they've been very aggressive on regulations, and sometimes you get the impression that EPA is the arbiter for reliability issues, but the actuality, that's your all's responsibility. And I would just ask both of you, do you feel like that, can you coordinate, can you comment on the coordination between the agencies? Are we making progress in that regard, and what is your personal view about that issue? Mr. Muller.
Well, I remember that hearing quite well, having testified at it. I guess We hear that there's talk going on between the staffs at FERC and the EPA. I'll have to get back to you with more details as to actually the substance of those discussions. We talked about the 5th year that plants would get. We're a year into it. It's effective April 16th, 2015. That is. Most people think that entities will get another year if they're going to be retrofitting. And then there's the question of the 5th year. The industry has told us that until the federal law is resolved between the Federal Power Act, the Clean Air Act, that they're very reluctant to even ask for the 5th year. So that plays out differently in different load pockets, depending on how much coal is going to be retired. We're particularly concerned about Northern Ohio and the timeline there, but there are other areas. So I would just hope, and I think I've been consistent in urging the EPA that they be very involved with the market operators, 2 of whom will be on your next panel, so that if you know, the faster you rush a job, the more expensive it is to consumers. So as long as they're engaged and they have some kind of a mechanism to perhaps give another extension of time, if they just get the new generation or the new transmission built in particular load pockets, that's where it gets so complicated. It's about physics, and it's about the flow of electricity, and it's just not universally the same everywhere.
Right. Ms. LaFleur, do you have a comment?
Yes, it's my understanding that there's a couple things in place. There's a regularly telephone conference between all the RTOs, DOE, FERC, and the EPA, and in-person meetings ad hoc between FERC and the EPA. In preparation for this hearing, I got copies of a lot of the, what do you call them, PowerPoints of the tech conference. It was really a report from different RTOs and what they're seeing. In addition, I initiated and Commissioner Mueller and I co-chair an ongoing forum between FERC and the state regulators. We meet at every NARUC meeting and have EP there in person to hear what's coming out, what's emerging, what do we think the issues are. In May of last year, we put out a policy statement on how FERC would approach the 5th year if anyone came to us. We haven't heard from anyone yet because they're still working on their 4th year, but we wanted to be ready so we could hit the ground running. I agree with Commissioner Mueller that Northern Ohio is one of the places that's been identified. I was there 3 weeks ago. I know we're going to hear from the Ohio chairman today, and we have to work closely on all of those things through these various fora.
Yeah. Mr. Gordon Van Wiley is with us with the ISO up in the Northeast, and of course you mentioned that there are a lot of concerns about the Northeast, and I'm sure he'll get into that. But are there any other areas that you all have particular concern about? You mentioned Northeast, you mentioned Northern Ohio. What are some other geographical areas?
Well, the Midwest, and you'll hear from Claire Moeller from MISO later too, but just the number of megawatts that are either being closed down or retrofitted is enormous in a relatively short amount of time.
Right.
New England is clearly at the cutting edge, but the Midwest and also the New York were places that had a lot to say when we had our tech conferences.
And we still have a lot of unknowns out there, too, because, as we say, EPA is looking at greenhouse gas regulations. Are they going to be applicable to the existing plants? They haven't quite finalized the new construction, so we have a lot of question marks out there, a lot of unknowns. And at this time, my time has expired, so I'll recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Rush, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I have a different line of questions. I'm going to begin with Commissioner LaFleur. Commissioner LaFleur, in your testimony, you cite the lack of pipeline infrastructure as your first area of concern in ensuring adequate pipeline capacity to support both gas-fired electric generation and other gas customers. Lack of access in pipeline infrastructure is also an issue that I have concerns about. But for me, the concerns are regarding the lack of access for minorities and women when it comes to jobs and contracts and economic opportunity available in the pipeline industry. Specifically, over the last Congress, this subcommittee heard from witnesses from all aspects of the pipeline industry, including private companies and associations, as well as from federal agencies, and each time I posed a simple question. Are there women, are there minorities who are owners, builders, and operators of pipelines in this country, and what are their levels of participation? Because I could never get a straight answer on this question, I drafted language in the Pipeline Safety, Regulatory Certainty, and Job Creation Act of 2011, which called for a comprehensive GAO report examining the levels of engagement and participation of minority-owned, women-owned, and disadvantaged business enterprises and contractors involved in the construction and operation of pipelines in this country. To absolutely no one's surprise, the GAO report came back stating that the levels of minority participation in the pipeline industry was so small that it was almost negligible. Now, I understand that this is not your area of expertise, but I want you to know that my office was reaching out to you and now to in general to work with us on establishing strategies for increasing access for minorities and women in the pipeline industry. As you stated in your testimony, over the next few years, we will have to build up the nation's pipeline infrastructure in order to address the shale oil and gas boom and make sure the energy is getting to urban areas, rural centers, wherever it's needed at. As policymakers, it is our responsibility to ensure that all segments of the population are able to participate in building this critical infrastructure, and that all communities have access to the economic opportunities that will be available in the pipeline industry over the next decade. Again, I look forward to working with FERC, engaging FERC on this issue, and I'd like to ask both of you, do you have any responses or any comments to share with the subcommittee now that I've raised this particular issue?
Well, thank you, Congressman Rush, for bringing up an important issue and one I probably haven't thought enough about. I am involved in several organizations for women in energy. I actually was meeting with one group of women last night, and we were talking anecdotally about how there were more women in electricity than in natural gas as a anecdotal impression, and that backs up what you're saying. And more of them are on the regulatory legal side than on the construction side. I've also met with the Association of Blacks in Energy, which is headquartered here in the city, and that's an issue they're working on. I'd certainly, we don't at FERC give out contracts or choose who would construct the pipelines, but there's going to be a period of infrastructure opportunities, so I'd be willing as a citizen in the industry to work further with any of the groups to help make that happen. It certainly should be opportunities.
Congressman, I think we want to get all kinds of new people into the energy industry, minorities, women, young people. It's an aging industry. There's a great need for skilled labor, so to the extent that vocational education can be emphasized again in this country as it once was, that will help on the skilled labor side. I've tried to go out and be a force for involvement in what's, I think, a very exciting industry. I was the guest speaker at the annual meeting of the Association of American Blacks in Energy in Columbus, Ohio a few years ago. So I've certainly tried to get a greater involvement from everyone in this industry because I think it's the greatest industry and it's a great future and great jobs.
Thank you. At this time, I recognize the gentleman from Louisiana, Dr. Cassidy, for 5 minutes.
Yes, and Mr. Rush, I agree with you. This industry has tremendous opportunity for folks who are minorities. One of the reasons I represent firms in which there's female and minority participation, and one of the reasons our side is so interested in Keystone XL is that those 20,000 direct jobs created will be just among the working class that most are in need of jobs right now. So I agree with you, Mr. Moeller. It's a great opportunity for many people. I just wish that the President would sign on to creating those jobs. I was at a bipartisan dinner last night, actually, put on by one of my colleagues. The point was made that EPA is currently driving our energy policy. I'm struck that you mentioned the potential for shortages in New England and the mothballing, I gather, of many coal-fired plants. This must be billions of dollars worth of investments being replaced by other billions of investments, all paid by families struggling to meet their current bills. So I guess my point being, is that a fair assessment that EPA's environmental regulation is now driving our electrical market?
It's certainly it's a factor, yes.
Now, the factor could be 1% or it could be 90%. But I gather that these mothballed coal plants, it's 90% EPA. Is that a fair statement?
I don't know if I'd pick a number, but
Give me a ballpark. I'm not going to hold you to it. I mean, is it 1 or is it 100? Or is it where would you make it closer to? With 100 being highest.
Well, if it depends on the plant, but in some plants, 100%. I mean, they are being cut down clearly because of air regulations. In cases, you'd probably say 50% because they're being retrofitted. They'll still burn coal, but they're of the right vintage where that investment makes sense.
Now, I'm from a natural gas state. I'm all about natural gas. On the other hand, I'm all about having a diversified fuel source. It really does seem as if we're putting a heck of a lot of our eggs in the natural gas basket for no other reason than EPA is driving this. Is that correct?
That's a major factor. Prices and the access is also part of it, but that's where we're concerned from a reliability perspective. If you're dependent on a pipeline and just-in-time fuel supply, it's a lot different than a 60-day pile of coal.
Yeah, it seems that way. And if you're dependent on one plant and the other has been, with the diversified fuel, has been mothballed, then your whole supply chain is, if you will, just in time. Fair statement?
Yeah, if you have more pipeline access, that helps diversify your options, but that's one of the problems. Some plants are dependent on one pipe.
Now, I'm struck, Ms. LaFleur, the good Louisiana name, I don't know if you are, but could be. You speak specifically of New England and the problems that they have. Will the development of the Marcellus Shale bring some relief there? Obviously, the supply is closer. Will further development of that benefit?
Well, my dad was French Canadian, but there's a lot of LaFleurs in Louisiana. Sure. The fact that gas is being extracted much closer to the Northeast in the Marcellus means pipelines have a shorter way to go, but the issues that makes the issues we're working on somewhat more limited, but we're trying to get pipeline that last couple hundred miles to the plant, because most of the suppliers bring gas to the major junction points, and then you need to build laterals to specific plants. But definitely the supply from the Marcellus helps, yes.
Okay, and I also understand that there's a market issue in terms of how the New England plants buy their gas. You allude to that. I don't understand it well enough. Could you elaborate?
Well, in general terms, the natural gas and electric markets attract capital differently. Pipelines build based on 10 or 15-year commitments, and electricity, because it's a real-time product, is priced in a 3-year forward market or in the day-ahead market. So the generators might not have enough certainty of their long-term future to make a 15-year commitment, which means we're going to have to get creative about how we structure these things and get pipelines built.
So ideally, you would allow now, but a plant in the south, for example, which does not have this problem, is it because we already have the pipeline infrastructure, or because they are able to enter into these 15-year commitments?
A little bit of both. In some of the vertically integrated states, the State regulators have decided that customers should back up the long-term gas contracts. They also have considerably less gas dependency in general, so they don't have the, if you made every generator in New England buy a firm contract, pretty soon you'd have way too many. You'd be having customers pay for way too many pipelines. So it's a combination of factors.
Okay, well, I'm out of time. I yield back. Thank you both.
Thank you. At this time, I recognize the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Dingell, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, your courtesy is appreciated. Thank you. These questions for Mr. Moeller, yes or no, I think. In your testimony, you state the country is increasing natural gas electricity generation because EPA air regulations will force coal-fired plants to be retired or retrofitted. Do you believe that the increased availability and lower cost of natural gas has played an equally important role in our transition to natural gas? Yes or no?
Yes.
Now, it is my understanding that some coal-fired plants undergoing retrofits have been granted revised air permits and extensions in order to comply with EPA regulations such as mercury and air toxic standard. For older coal-fired plants that will not be retrofitted, do you believe it will be necessary to allow them to continue operating past the compliance deadline of the mercury rule in order to maintain reliability? Please answer yes or no.
In some cases, yes.
Now, do you believe that renewable electrical generation, such as wind and solar, should be factored into resource adequacy? Please answer yes or no.
Yes.
Do you want to for the record an explanatory of that, if you please?
Be happy to.
Now, in FERC's response to a letter signed by myself and other members of the Michigan delegation, FERC indicated that it was in the process of preparing an environmental assessment on the issue of the trunk line mainline abandonment project. Has the EA been completed? And if not, when will it?
I don't know. I'll
All right.
check out, get back to you.
Would you submit that, please?
Sure.
Now, when do you anticipate FERC making the final decision on the project proposal?
I'll have to get back to you on that.
All right. Now, Commissioner LaFleur, thank you for your presence. In your testimony, you note that more planning to address the issue of gas-electric interdependence will be necessary. As you also note, there is no requirement that generators enter into long-term gas pipeline contracts. Do you believe FERC needs the authority to require longer-term contracts? Yes or no?
I don't think we need more authority at this time.
At the end of your testimony, you state that you will find ways to use FERC's authority to address this issue. Do you believe that FERC needs additional authority in order to ensure reliability for all of our natural gas needs? Would you please answer yes or no?
No.
Mr. Chairman, I note that I have completed my questions with 2 minutes remaining. I return to you with thanks.
Very impressive. Thank you, sir. This time, I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Olson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to the witnesses. Commissioner Moeller, Commissioner LaFleur, thank you so much for your time and expertise. With the administration's war on coal, surge capacity is shrinking in many states across the country. My home state of Texas needs 5 large power plants by 2014-2015 to keep growing like we've been growing, or we risk rolling blackouts, as you alluded to in 2011. One way we can prevent these brownouts and blackouts from happening is to order power plants to keep generating beyond the 24/7 limits that they have, keep that power up online. And that's for emergency conditions only. That may lead, again, these may lead to power generation collapses. Unfortunately, we've had 2 examples recently where power plants have been kept up online and then third parties have come back in behind them and sued them for damages. And some of these have been 7 figures in damages. I introduced a bill last Congress that passed unanimously from this committee, unanimously on the floor. Unfortunately, it died in the Senate, which many bills did last Congress. But I just want to talk to you guys about that. Do you support that bill? Is that something viable to address this power shortage capacity we may have in Texas?
And last year I testified in support of that bill in front of this committee.
Just to make sure nothing didn't change your mind. Commissioner LaFleur?
Yes, I support that targeted bill to give relief if you're ordered to stay on.
Great. Again, Commissioner Miller, you talked about the 2011 power crisis we had in Texas, basically the wind power crisis. And 12% of our demand dropped offline almost automatically. About 50 power plants were impacted by that. Most importantly for Texans, the Super Bowl was in Dallas that weekend, almost got canceled because of no power at the Cowboys Stadium. Could you please elaborate on what you learned from that incident and what advice you can give me for my state to take away from this? Got the great report there.
I will again commend the report that FERC and NERC did together on it. It's a great read. It's a good primer. It has 32 recommendations, mainly to the legislatures and the public utility commissions of those states. And I think they're in various phases of implementing those recommendations. To me, what hit home was that people felt like they either legally couldn't talk to each other or they felt there was a perception that they couldn't talk to each other legally, in addition to a number of problems with inadequate weatherization of a lot of those power plants. So I think they're on the weatherization. The communication set of issues, though, I think is an issue in every region of this country. And that's where I think we'll really be pushing over the summer to make sure, we don't know whether we have to take formal action at FERC or informal action, but to make sure that when we have another one of these cold weather events, it's a matter of when, not if, and the systems are stressed, and they can be stressed anywhere, but New England and the Midwest are our top concerns, that the right operators of the grid, the electric system, the pipelines, the generators are all in a position where they can share information without a fear of breaking the law so that people's service is disrupted. In the case of the Northwest in 2009, there was a power plant that could have relieved a lot of the problems. It was around Portland, Oregon, but the utility in Washington State was afraid to call that utility, thinking they might be violating the law if they did. So that's what I'll be pushing on, and I think the rest of the commission as well. Going into next winter, since we've had two such warm winters in a row, it's not going to last very much longer.
Commissioner Fuller, anything to add, ma'am?
I agree that communication was one of the big lessons, and that's what we need to work on, and have already given some guidance as to what's allowed so that people don't think our regulations are stopping that. I think also situational awareness between different operators, both adjoining electric operators and different gas operators, was a big lesson of that incident.
Another lesson in Texas is we had to get our power from Mexico. When that crisis happened, we had to go across the border to get that power from another country. And that scares me a little bit, that we're dependent upon a foreign nation as opposed to taking care of our own needs. And also, it's not just cold air, cold weather. We had the summer of 2011, every city in Texas, every single one of them was over 100 degrees for the whole month of August. If that happens again with the war on coal, we've tried to get the Las Brisas power plant up online, the White Stallion power plant, coal power plant, pet coke plant, shut down. They pulled back because of EPA regulations and these lawsuits. We've got to get the legal system out of here and let the people do what the people need to do. Thank you. Yield back the balance of my time.
This time, I recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. McNerney, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for having this hearing. I think it's an important and interesting issue. Mr. LaFleur, you mentioned that reliability and security were your top issues. You must be familiar with the San Bruno explosion a few years ago. How typical is the condition of those pipelines throughout the country? And it seemed to me that it was a combination of lack of maintenance or age of the pipes plus lack of inspections to make sure that they were operating. There was also people didn't have access to the valves to turn them off and so on. How vulnerable are we to those just due to natural causes?
Well, I certainly hope the pipelines in San Bruno were not typical, but as I'm sure you know, both the state of California and PHMSA, which is part of the Department of Transportation here, have put out some strong new regulations that require more inspection to make sure that particularly older pipelines in high consequence areas are maintained correctly. And I think our job at FERC is to make sure that we have supportive rate regulation for those gas pipeline requirements.
So it'll be a little bit higher rates for
It's
for
more a
customers.
matter of if you, we've had a few cases, we have some pending, so I have to be careful of how pipelines are required to cover additional expenses that might be required for inspection and how that works technically within their tariffs.
So how vulnerable are our national pipeline network to cyber attacks? I mean, could a cyber attack result in something like that, or other types of disruptions, major disruptions?
I think any major critical network that is run by computer systems, and that includes gas and electric, are vulnerable to cyber attacks, and that's why both voluntary and, in the case of electricity, mandatory standards are very important.
Well, that's good. So a part of the legislation that's being considered is to require sharing of information, but there aren't that many advocates for actually requiring utilities to do certain things to protect themselves. So where do you think we need to fall on that issue?
Well, on the electric side, we do have mandatory regulations under the Energy Policy Act of 2005. We do regulate that at FERC. I think the biggest thing we need in legislation is that information sharing, as well as someone having emergency authority in the case of an emergency. And I think most of the proposals I've seen have both of those elements in them.
But they don't have standards then for equipment or software.
I think if I were the queen of the world, mandatory standards would be good. I think getting some legislation passed, even the more modest legislation, would help a lot. Information share the top priority.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Mueller, you mentioned that we need increased flexibility to address the pipeline capacity issue. Is this a regulatory or a statutory issue, in your opinion?
Well, it's a regulatory issue primarily. If you ask me for statutory recommendations with the intent of getting more pipeline in, I could come up with some. But I think for the most part, people have been fairly satisfied with the process we have at FERC for new pipelines. If you cross a state line, you come to FERC for a certificate to build it. And it's a public process. The routes always get changed. And then there's the regulatory cost recovery that we handle with. I mean, it could be done quicker. Again, if you want recommendations, I can give you those.
Do you think that when you say flexibility, do you mean increased capacity and more pipelines? Is that what you mean by flexibility?
I think both operationally and additional infrastructure. We clearly need more pipe in New England. They're at the end of the pipe. They're more dependent. On the other hand, as you'll hear from the Midwest later on, there's some question as to which power plants that the grid operates are fed by which pipes. And I'm not suggesting this, but there's no equivalent kind of regional oversight of the pipeline network like there is on electricity. So the coordination it's just different. And that's where we need the kind of the communication flexibility, particularly when we get to times when the system is very stressed and there's the worry of not enough gas to go around.
Thank you. Good time, Mr. Chairman.
You got it. You hit the number. Perfect. Thank the gentleman. Recognize myself for 5 minutes to ask questions. Mr. Mueller, in response to the chairman that had asked you some questions, I think you responded specifically about some concerns in northern Ohio related to their coal plants. Can you expand on the concerns that you have there?
Yes, and I know we have the chairman of the Ohio Commission coming up later, so I wouldn't want to usurp his expertise. But we have a zone in northern Ohio where a number of plants are being shut down in the next 2 years, perhaps. There's a need for greater either generation in that load pocket or more transmission or both. And when the market did, because Commissioner LaFleur alluded to the 3-year forward capacity market, and new generation did not clear in that market because the prices were suppressed by a lot of demand response. Some concern whether that demand response is actually going to be there in the summer of 2015. So there's a lot of issues. They come together in the summer of 2015 when, of course, the load is the highest, and it's something we're watching very closely.
Thank you. You were also talking about kind of a concern about regulation, if there's a haste to put regulations in place quickly, that it, or to add more on top, that it can actually add to the cost of electricity for consumers. Can you expand on what you were referring to there?
Yes. Well, given the number of megawatts in this country, and they're spread out around most of the country, there's not a lot in the Northwest or the Northeast anymore, or California, but the number of coal plants that are being retrofitted in a short amount of time, there's a squeeze on the engineering talent, the skilled labor component. There's some argument there are not enough Boilermakers to go around. The supplies, just the supply chain gets squeezed the shorter that time frame is to try and get it all done to meet the regulations. So like any job in your house, if you want it done quicker, you're going to pay more. And in this case, consumers will bear that, and I hope that is kept in mind.
Is there any one agency that you're referring to in terms of regulation? We see the EPA throwing a lot of this on top of industry. Again, when industry talks to us, they talk about the added cost that it forces on consumers as they're doing this. So there's definitely a cost associated with it. Is it EPA? Are there others as well that you're referring to?
No, it's primarily EPA. We're talking about the I'm talking about the air regulations, and I'm not here to bash them, but
we do that. Don't worry. When we hear about a lot of the things that they do that that don't have anything to do with improving health or safety, it's more just to kind of put burdens to, it seems like, pursue an agenda. And this isn't a question to you. This is more things we see in the hearings when we have them before us, and it just seems like they keep going in their own direction to pursue an agenda. Whether it's kind of a cap and trade de facto through regulation, when Congress is, has expressed in a number of different ways that that's not the direction we'd like to go. And, hopefully, I know we've got legislation, many of us are supporting to say Congress shouldn't put some kind of carbon tax in place. Maybe we'll have more hearings on that. But, when they see them going off in their own direction anyway to try to impose regulations that just carry out an agenda, there's a cost to that. And I think those costs need to be brought up. I do want to touch on something you talked about in your opening statement, where you were talking about this revolution in natural gas that's come about through hydraulic fracturing, through horizontal drilling, that technology that's allowed us to open up vast reserves of new energy here in America. And of course, we hear about EPA looking at trying to get into that and try to regulate what states already do. States do a great job of regulating hydraulic fracturing. It's been very successful, created great jobs, but also great potential for American energy security. And of course, that's threatened. You talked about technology allowing us to find more natural resources, and I do have concerns that that as these natural resources are found, that the government regulators themselves could impede that innovation, that technology, if they do try to regulate it in a way that doesn't allow us to access those natural resources. So I don't know if you want to touch on that, if either of you, both Mr. Moeller or Mr. LaFleur.
Well, this is, again, those won't be our decisions because that's not in our jurisdiction, but hydrofracking and horizontal drilling and the shale revolution has been, it's been a revolution. A few years ago at FERC, the most controversial things we dealt with were LNG import facilities. Now they're LNG export facilities.
And then if Mr. LaFleur, before the clock expires, any...
Well, I agree that we're going to have to closely monitor regulations that come out that might affect gas extraction because they could affect gas supplies. It's not something we're specifically responsible for. We really just certificate the pipeline network.
All right, thank you. I think Mr. Ranking Member, Mr. Waxman, is up next.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. The nation's electricity generation portfolio is in the midst of a significant transition. We doubled our capacity to generate renewable electricity from wind and solar in just 4 years. And last year, nearly half of our all-new generation capacity came from wind. There's also been a large increase in natural gas generation. Commissioner LaFleur, What is the primary reason utilities are increasing their natural gas generation?
I'd say the primary, if I had to point to one reason, is the reduced cost of natural gas. I mean, most of the nation's coal fleet was built when that was by far the cheapest fuel, and now that gas is the cheapest fuel, people at the market is responding.
In your testimony, you discussed how natural gas generation also supports the expansion of renewable energy. Could you explain how wind and solar power benefit from the increased use of natural gas for electricity generation?
Yes, because wind and solar, they don't consume fuel, but they can only operate when the wind is blowing or the sun is shining for the most part. You need quick ramping resources that can fill in when they ramp down. And because natural gas machines tend to be more flexible, they're well adapted to that filling in with wind and solar.
As utilities move from coal-fired generation to cheaper, cleaner, and more flexible sources of power, we hear complaints about the retirements of coal-fired plants. Commissioner LaFleur, my understanding is that most of the planned retirements are the oldest, least efficient coal plants. These are plants that have operated for 50 or 60 years or even longer. Is that right?
Yes, for the most part. I mean, we're monitoring this. We get reports from the different regions of the country, and most of the first coal plants to retire are the older, built in the 50s and 60s, most expensive to run, and for that reason they were rarely operated. It's like if they came up with a new rule that you needed some expensive braking system for your car, first thing you do is put it on the car you drive to work every day. But if you had a car you only drove on vacation, you might say, gee, do I want to spend the money on a car I drive once a year? Some of these plants were kind of on the edge of the system.
Okay. Well, moving away from the oldest, dirtiest generation is reducing our carbon pollution. Many other coal-fired power plants are going to be installing modern pollution controls to reduce their toxic emissions for the first time. That's going to provide tremendous health benefits. This transition in our energy sector is important for the climate and for public health. It's a positive development, but like all major transitions, it requires planning. Commissioner LaFleur, in your testimony, you said that this is a time to plan, not to panic. Do you believe the communications, scheduling, infrastructure issues we're talking about today are manageable?
Yes, I do.
Is this an area where FERC should be promulgating national rules, or is regional action more appropriate?
As I said in my testimony, right now I think the infrastructure issues are better tackled regionally because the different markets have different rules. But if we do something on either the schedules or on communication, those might lend themselves to national action.
Well, sounds like FERC and grid operators are doing exactly what they should be doing, identifying the challenges posed by this transition and developing solutions to address those challenges. We're moving away from a coal-heavy energy portfolio to a truly diverse energy portfolio. If we want to prevent the worst impacts of climate change, our energy infrastructure will need to continue changing in the years and decades to come. Commissioner LaFleur, as regional action is taken to accommodate the energy transition we're seeing, in your view, would it be prudent for regional planners to anticipate that greater carbon pollution emission reductions are likely to be required in the future?
Most of the planners, whether they're at the state level or at the regional level, do scenario planning, and it's probably prudent to model, well, what if there's new carbon legislation? We don't have that legislation now, so it's not an immediate thing to plan for, but they probably model multiple futures, and I think they should.
Well, I would think that they would anticipate not having the same do-nothing Congress we have now forever. And even stop clock is correct twice a day. So perhaps we will get bipartisan support and do something about climate change, and that, I think, would be all to the good. Thank you very much for your...
This time I recognize the gentleman from Kansas, Mr. Pompeo, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to talk about the pipeline permitting process. So there was a recent GAO study on this from February of this year, February 2013, that talked about the process. And in that report, it said that FERC does not track the timeframes for these permits being granted. And in light of stakeholder concerns, do you think that FERC should be tracking, I'll ask you both, do you think, yes or no, do you think FERC should be tracking the time that permits are being granted from application to completion?
I think we should be aware of that. My understanding of the INGA report is that it said FERC did a pretty good job meeting
This was a GAO,
deadlines.
I'm referring
Oh,
to a
I'm
GAO
sorry.
report that said,
okay.
that you all aren't tracking how long it takes. That they had to go to public records to identify the lengths of the permit process, that you all kept no such records. Is that true?
I don't want to say something I'm not positive of, but I think we should know how long our process takes, yes.
Great, that's my question. Chairman Wallace, should we agree?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Now, on the INGA did report that said that 20% of natural gas pipelines experienced delays of 6 months or more, largely because the delays occurred after FERC's NEPA analysis had been completed, which has a 90-day requirement under EPAC. Is that statement also correct?
Yes, it's my understanding that it is. A lot of the delays are in the conditions that are put on in the FERC environmental permits that have subsequent conditions.
That, as far as I know, that's correct.
So A, FERC doesn't know how long it's taken, and B, it's not complying with EPAC. So in my view, there's work that needs to be done in this permitting process. I'm actually going to propose some legislation that does that. I hope it to be bipartisan. I think it's a good government solution which puts cabins some risk and allows pipelines to move forward where they can have a little more certainty. I guess I'd ask each of you, I'm happy to share it with you and talk to you about it and get your input, but Chairman Will, you suggested that you had some ideas on how we might do this permitting process more quickly. Would you be willing to share a couple of those thoughts with us this morning?
Yes, I think that the challenge that you alluded to is that the resource agencies typically don't have the accountability to come back with an answer. We're thing in licensing, and it's the way the statute is. And if you create some timeline ability, I'd be more responsive.
Yeah. Do you agree with that, Commissioner LaFleur?
Yes, I do. I agree both on the problem and that we do not control all the other agencies who have to act to get a permit out, and I'd be happy to look at legislation.
Great, thank you. I'd love to give you all more capacity to just control those processes, and the legislation I'm drafting, I think, will move us along that way. I wanted to just, one more thing on permitting that I want to talk about. I won't go through the list of permits. There's a very long list of folks you got to go please before you get to build some of this new capacity. But I want to talk about a statement that the President has made about NEPA process. He says now NEPA process will have to include an analysis of climate change, at least as reported in an article in Bloomberg on March 15th. From a natural gas infrastructure perspective, it seems to me this could be very problematic in terms of extending the timelines to get pipelines built. As the lead agency for approving the interstate natural gas pipeline constructions, tell me what you think the impact would be if FERC were required to take into account climate change as part of each of its NEPA analysis.
Well, it's not going to make it any faster.
Do you have the capacity and resources to do that analysis? Where would you begin?
I think a lot of it comes down to what is the scope of our review. There's been a lot of controversy about, does FERC review the pipeline it's certificating or the entire life cycle of the gas? And there's been some court cases on that. As long as we are working on the pipeline or the project that we are looking at, I think if new laws are passed, we will incorporate them in our review.
That's a good statement. It's we're cabined by the certificate in front of us, and that's not something we've done. And I don't know how we develop that expertise. I'd leave it to our Office of Energy Projects.
Yeah, I don't know how you do it either. You don't have the expertise, in fact. Yes or no? Do you think you have statutory authority to do that today, to consider climate change as part of a NEPA project?
Maybe we should review the court decisions on that before.
Okay, I'm happy to let you do that. But I would appreciate a response to whether FERC believes, or you each, the commissioners, believe you have the statutory authority to consider climate change as a part of a pipeline, interstate pipeline approval process.
I'd also like to get back to you on that.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you very much. This time, recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I agree with my colleague that FERC's not prepared to do that, but there was a bill here last session that was going to give FERC the authority to approve the Trans-Canada pipeline, and I think your testimony was that you're not prepared to do that either. And so hopefully we have problems on both sides of our aisle with giving agencies responsibilities that they're not ready for. But let me get back to my line of questioning. Both commissioners, welcome, and thank you both for being here today. I represent a district in Texas, and so ERCOT is our RTO, and I've heard that there's some pretty serious concerns that are about there not being enough forecasted power generation to ensure reliability in the ERCOT market in the future. Could both of you please speak to whether you think that the market structure under ERCOT is enough to incentivize the creation of new generation? And if you don't think it is, what can we do? And I know our next panel, we have a former Public Utility Commissioner for Texas and also our Railroad Commission Chairman, so I'll ask him the same questions. So,
well, Congressman, thank you for the question. ERCOT jealously guards its own jurisdiction, so that FERC doesn't tread in it. But of course, we watch what's going on, and we have a responsibility on the reliability side, not on the market administration side. Mm-hmm. And you have two very fine public utility commissioners in Texas that are debating this very issue of, do you need a capacity market? What do you do with the real-time energy price because of the reserve margin declining for some of the reasons that have been discussed today? As I look to the summer, the summer concerns are California, Texas, and Boston. They were last summer, going to be this summer again. If we have a really, really hot summer in Texas, you'll see this debate probably on a daily basis.
I would add that most of the U.S. markets that have gone to competitive electric markets do have some sort of a forward market, as is being considered in Texas right now, and that is the very purpose of attracting capital future ability. It is not within our jurisdiction. I feel Mr. Smitherman's eyes on my back, so I'll let him take it from there.
Well, and I appreciate it, and being from Texas, we stand shoulder to shoulder in protecting ERCOT. I just want to make sure, and we did have rolling blackouts in February of 2011, and it seemed like I heard that our wind power growth, which has been phenomenal in Texas, helped stabilize that situation. Is that information FERC has?
Well, we could get back to you, but the focus of the report was really on the outages as opposed to the role that wind had, but I'll get back to you on that.
Okay, I appreciate it. In light of the increase in natural gas electricity generation in February of 2012, FERC issued a request for comments regarding natural gas electric coordination. In August of 2012, over 1,200 stakeholders attended 5 regional technical conferences hosted by FERC to discuss these issues. What are each of your biggest takeaways from those conferences that FERC received?
I think our takeaway was that a lot of the issues are regional in nature, but there's some cut-across issues that we should work on, particularly communications and scheduling, the harmonization of the days. I think another takeaway is that this situation is evolving fast, so we need to really stay on top of it. New England is where the issues are right now, but it's evolving everywhere, and we heard that in the conferences.
I would agree that this is an issue everywhere to varying degrees, and the gratifying thing is that a year ago not everybody thought it was an issue. Now almost universally people agree that there are challenges out there, and we're trying to keep the momentum going at the Commission to keep people focused on solutions.
Commissioner Mueller, after the Southwest outage of February of 2011, FERC and the North American Electric Reliability Corporation conducted a study for the causes of the event. The ensuing report that was issued in August of 2011 had 32 recommendations for industry and regulators in an attempt to avoid a similar occurrence. What are some of the more important recommendations? Is there a plan for enacting these?
There is a plan. I haven't had an update for a couple of months, but the focus on most of the recommendations was to regulators and legislators in those 3 states. The primary recommendation on the electric side was winterize the system, go into the winter with the same kind of urgency you go into the summer in ERCOT. And I think there's been a lot of progress, and I think Barry Smitherman can answer a lot of those questions. Some of the others are tougher. Like Arizona doesn't have any storage. We had a conference to try and promote storage, gas storage, underground, but that doesn't seem to be materializing. So I expect another report on the status of the 32 recommendations sometime later this year, but it's something I'm very concerned about.
Well, and I only have a couple seconds left, but I appreciate what FERC does and the stability that it does, and I'm glad you came for our committee. I appreciate it.
Gentleman's time has expired. At this time, recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Griffith, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that, your courtesies in recognizing me. I would also say to the witnesses here that it was very refreshing to hear folks from an agency come in and on 2 occasions say, I don't believe we need more authority at this time. It's very unusual to hear those comments in this committee, at least. Also, Ms. LaFleur, I note, and it's been mentioned before, but I would note again, because sometimes the folks on the some of the folks on the other side of the aisle want to think it's just gas prices that are causing a problem, and you did acknowledge in your written testimony on page 2 that it's repowering older fossil generation that is uneconomic to operate or to retrofit for new environmental regulations when talking about the shutdown of coal. Do appreciate you recognizing that it's a combination. And likewise, in light of the fact that experts have previously testified in another hearing in this committee that they anticipate that gas will rise by about $4 by the end of the year, and that point coal again becomes competitive on pricing. Would you acknowledge that point? If we get to the numbers, but once we reach that point, that then it would be predominantly the new environmental regulations that are shutting down our facilities, coal facilities. No.
I don't see exactly that way, no.
All right.
Okay.
But it's still a major concern, and you have acknowledged that, and I appreciate
Absolutely.
that. You know, I thought it was interesting, somebody else brought up the cyber attacks, and apparently in 2012 we had a series of cyber attacks on gas pipeline companies and so forth. You recall seeing that information?
Yes.
And the concern was, I mean, they might have been trying to steal some information on how to do the fracking because we've been so successful on it, but also there were concerns that there were cyber attacks on the valves and the on-off switches, basically. Isn't that correct?
It was on the energy management system that regulates the pipelines and that opens valves and runs compressors and so forth, yes.
So that it's theoretically a successful cyber attack could close down or open up gas pipelines, close down ones we don't want closed down and open up ones we don't want opened. Isn't that correct?
Yes, theoretically, yes.
Now, I'm no expert on using the computer, but I was sitting here when that question was asked, and I started looking for, attacks and cyber attacks, et cetera, on coal facilities. And the only thing I could find were EPA attacks on coal. I didn't find anything about foreign powers. Have you run across any instances where it appears that foreign powers are attempting to figure out ways to disrupt our supply of coal?
There have been cyber attacks on the energy management systems that turn plants on and off, and like FERC, cyber attacks are fuel neutral. They would mess up whatever was being turned on and off. I'm not aware that I remember of any specifically at a coal unit.
But I do think that in regard to your concerns about the pipelines, you previously indicated that one of the concerns was getting the pipelines to the facilities and so forth, and that it was a whole lot easier to have a supply of coal sitting there on the ground than it was to have the natural gas automatically show up when it was needed at the power plant. Didn't you indicate that to us earlier?
I think I said that was what was different about gas, that it came in a pipeline, yes.
And so if an energy production plant had a supply of coal and it was a coal burning plant, it would be less likely that for a few hours or even for a day that somebody could affect that supply of energy at that power plant than it would be if somebody did a successful cyber attack on our pipeline. Isn't that true?
Certainly the coal pile doesn't have the cyber risk, but I think you could still affect the energy management system that turns the plant on and off. I mean, we need to guard against these risks wherever they are.
All right. I do appreciate that as well. In regard to the natural gas supply, we're already having trouble getting the pipelines there. Do you think that there needs to be redundancy built in those pipelines? I know that you don't want to charge the customer too much and you don't want to have too many pipelines, but at the same time, don't you think we would need more than just one pipeline to the facilities, or to make sure that if something happened to one supply, that there would be another supply readily available if we're going to put all our eggs in that basket or in one of those baskets?
Well, I'm not even sure I'd use the word redundancy. You need a robust grid, a robust network of more than one source of supply in different regions and localities, yes.
And it is always a little bit dangerous to put a huge percentage of your energy into one fuel source. It's always better to have multiple sources available to supply the electricity for the American citizen. Isn't that true?
Yes, I believe that.
And so it would be ill-advised for our country to completely eliminate coal as an energy source in light of the fact that we have the world's greatest supply of coal. Wouldn't that also be true?
I think we're much better off with the coal plants being retrofitted, as the vast majority of them are, than losing all of them.
I thank you and yield back.
This time I recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Tomko, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for a very interesting topic today. And let me welcome Commissioner Moeller and Commissioner LaFleur. And your expertise is very helpful in this discussion. And further, Commissioner LaFleur, let me thank you as a representative in upstate New York, in the Capital Region, and Mohawk Valley for your prior service before your commissioner status. It was much appreciated then and much appreciated now. Commissioner LaFleur, the pipeline capacity issues in the Northeast region appears to be a greater constraint on natural distribution in other areas. We've had a lot of focus on that today, but primarily concerned about the Northeast. And are issues related to the siting of pipelines a constraint, or is this primarily a matter of needing to speed up the investments in natural gas infrastructure?
I think it's more of an investment issue. I mean, pipelines are harder to build in urban areas, but we've had a number of them built, so I have confidence that they'll be constructed if the investment comes forward.
And in terms of the investment, what, if anything, could be a response to that? What could enhance the investment opportunity?
Well, I think what ISO New England, I think they'll talk about, is working on is ways in which to structure the generation markets to motivate the generators to build in more fuel security, so invest or increase their commitments to pipelines or other dual fuel commitments or other gas storage. We do have LNG storage in the Northeast. Other ways of getting fuel security. So it's pricing the fuel security into the generation, I think, is the big response.
Thank you. And as utilities have reduced their coal-fired generation, we've seen reductions in carbon pollution from the energy sector. And increased natural gas generation is one factor in this drop of carbon pollution, but it's obviously not the only factor. So, Commissioner, would you agree that state-level renewable energy policies have helped to reduce emissions from the power sector?
Yes, I think they're driving a lot of renewable investment, including in upstate New York. As you know, if you drive up near Niagara Falls, you just see windmills as far as the eye can see.
Absolutely right. And as a result of their renewable energy policy, states like New York and Colorado and California are displaying a significant amount of renewable generation capacity. So to both commissioners, which state policies would you note have been the most effective in deploying renewable energy?
I think that renewable portfolio standards are certainly starting to be felt. We don't regulate it, but I'd point to Texas, but also other states. You mentioned upstate New York has a lot of wind. Some of the states have very effective small solar policies. States as diverse as California and New Jersey, which clearly have different weather, have very heavy penetration of home and business level solar, and the programs they have in place appear to be very effective at getting those done.
Congressman, I'm not really an expert on all 29 different renewable portfolio standards throughout the country, but I think the ones that have been most successful are the ones that have adequate transmission infrastructure to make sure that that power can move around from typically where it's generated to where it's consumed, and have the kind of flexibility that don't overly favor one or two sources.
So, and I would assume that the upgrades in interconnection are important in that regard?
They're vital, absolutely important, and it's usually difficult to site this transmission, so that's part of the challenge as well.
And to the policy area, which federal policies would you suggest have helped deploy renewable energy?
Well, certainly right now the production tax credits are having an impact on investment in that area. I also think federal R&D has helped bring down, as well as private R&D, has helped bring down the cost of some of the technologies.
Well, I go more toward market access and make sure that the transmission infrastructure is there to move the power around. And there are a variety of things we could talk to you later about that could promote that. We're doing an exercise at FERC Order 1000, which is an attempt to make the planning better on transmission.
Thank you. And Mr. Chair, I know my time has expired, so I yield back.
Thank you. At this time, I recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Ms. Chimkus, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. It's great to have you here. For and many coal-fired power plants have been retrofitted. Can we retrofit a coal-fired power plant to an existing plant to address a greenhouse gas rule or regulation?
I'm not an expert on that, but I think it's much harder than scrubbing things out of the stack.
It's impossible. There's no technology right now. The cost would triple the amount of infrastructure costs, and the electricity required to run this is probably about 30% of the generation capacity of a power plant at this time. So that just goes into the emissions, kind of the whole debate. What is toxic? What is not? That debate, and it does segue into both your sphere on reliability, because as we have this debate and concern about environmental rules and regulations, the pulling off of generation, it should be of major concern. Is that correct?
Well, in the case of other EPA regulations, like when we worked on mercury and air toxics, as the rules became final, we had to work at FERC and with the EPA to make sure we had the coordination and flexibility that was needed to make sure we protected reliability. If there are other suites of regulations, that will be equally necessary.
Well, let's talk, and Commissioner Mueller, you're more than welcome to chime in too. We know based upon MAC that anywhere from 50 to 70 gigawatts of coal-fired generation may be retired over the next decade. That's a lot, with 90% of coming within the next 5 years. So this next 3 to 5 window aligns with the compliance deadlines for EPA's utility MAC rule in places like the Midwest. Some of this coal-fired generation will be replaced with natural gas-fired power plants, and that's part of the debate of having them and also getting the natural gas and the pipeline siting. From your perspective, and this is for Commissioner Mueller, would you agree that the short compliance time frame for EPA's utility MAC rule is compounding reliability concerns for regions heavily reliant on coal, such as the Midwest and the Mid-Atlantic?
Yes, I do.
It's just a matter of numbers, isn't it?
Well, the environmental benefits are coming. The question is, if you squeeze them on too tight a timeline, there can be reliability challenges that that are probably going to land in our lap. So that's why I've urged the EPA to be flexible. If certain areas need a little more time, to give it to them.
And not just reliability, because it is reliability, but it segues into cost too. An unreliable grid is a costly grid, or wouldn't you argue? So from the individual consumer's point of view, that if the reliability of the grid, it becomes uncertain and there's a risk premium then paying for reliability, that will get passed on to the individual consumer, would it not?
It will, depending on the market structure, in different ways.
Given your background as a state public utility commissioner and now your experience at FERC, do you believe having a diverse range of fuel resources available to generate electricity is important to provide affordability and reliable service to customers?
Yes, I've never been a state commissioner, but optionality is always good.
And I understand that FERC does not have jurisdiction over generation, but would you agree that an over-reliance on any one particular fuel source could be problematic from a reliability perspective?
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. That would conclude. Oh, Mr. Gardner. I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Gardner, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome the commissioners to today's hearing. Thanks for being here to share your expertise. Mr. Moeller, Chairman Moeller, wanted to talk to you a little bit about some of the comments made in your testimony. You talk a little bit about traditional baseload generation will be needed to firm renewable energy resources. We hear a lot of talk about that, whether it's wind, solar, what backup will be needed. Is there a percentage that you can give me of that baseload generation? So, for instance, if you have a megawatt of wind production, what percent of firming baseload would you need for that 1 megawatt of wind?
Well, it depends on the wind, because your home state, Colorado, has really good wind. And
I live on the eastern winds.
Yes, you're choosing to talk about it later, but because of the characteristics of what comes off the rock, it's really good wind. So they don't have as much challenge firming it. They still have a challenge. Another area that might have a capacity factor of 20%. That means that you're going to 80% of the time you back it up. So
that'd be maybe for
wind quality differs.
For every 5 megs, you need 4 megs of baseload in that instance. Is that one way to look at it?
You need, yeah, right.
Okay. And then talking about pipeline issues, talking about production of natural gas, we have in Colorado several cities that are banning hydraulic fracturing. We also are hearing rumors that there may be a statewide initiative to ban hydraulic fracturing. If they go that direction, is there an interstate commerce issue that FERC would have to look at based on this transition to natural gas power generation?
Congressman, I don't think it'd be in our jurisdiction to do that, but I'm sure someone would be thinking about that.
And I would love to hear your thoughts, further thoughts on that, and perhaps maybe even somebody in the council's office talking a little bit about that issue specifically. When it comes to the EPA, we have seen a growing sort of decisions by the EPA when it comes to things like LNG export facilities, where EPA is asking targeted questions in their environmental assessments and analysis on pipelines and whether or not an LNG facility would require additional pipelines. Is the EPA consulting with FERC when they are requiring an analysis of pipeline need or capacity?
I don't believe so. I'll get back to you, but they certainly have submitted comments for the record on the environmental analysis.
Okay. And then, and I think Mr. Pompeo may have touched a little bit on this, but do you have an average time that it takes to site a pipeline in the U.S. on private land?
We might, but I'd have to get back to you on that.
That'd be great. And do you know? And if you could get back to me on federal land as well, do you have that answer off the top of your head? Okay, perfect. And then just are you working on ways? And this you can follow up with me on this as well. Working on ways that FERC can improve upon the time it takes to site a pipeline. I think that's an important conversation with those answers in mind.
Well, I have a lot of confidence in our Office of Energy Projects that doing the best job they can under the given circumstances and statutory responsibilities. As I alluded to earlier, one way to speed up the process would be to create some timelines and the accountability that comes with timelines on the resource agencies that a pipeline is also dependent on getting permits from.
Okay. And do you believe that coal still plays a role in our electric generation, and that it would be unwise to move too quickly to natural gas if there's no infrastructure to support it where it exists? Excuse me, if it does not exist to support it?
Well, coal is still an extremely significant part of our electricity mix and will be for the foreseeable future.
Mr. Chairman, I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Thank you. Well, I believe that is it. Commissioner Moeller and LaFleur, thank you all again for your testimony, and we look forward to your providing the additional information that was requested. And you all are dismissed at this time, but we do look forward to working with you as we move forward. I would like to call the second panel of witnesses. On the second panel today, we have the Honorable Barry Smitherman, who's the chairman of the Railway Commission of Texas. We have the Honorable Joshua Eppel, who's chairman of the Colorado Public Utilities Commission. We have Mr. Claire Moeller, who's Executive Vice President, Transmission and Technology for the Midwest Independent Transmission System Operator. We have Mr. Gordon Van Wiley, President and CEO of ISO New England. And we have Mr. Paul Hibbard, who's the Vice President of the Analysis Group. Todd Schnitzler, who's the Chairman of the Public Utility Commission of Ohio, was scheduled to be with us, but because of unexpected development, he is not here today. So welcome all of you. Thank you for agreeing to come and testify. And Mr. Smitherman, we'll begin with you. Each one of you will be given 5 minutes for your statement, and the little red light will come on when your time's expired. So we do thank you for being with us. We look forward to testimony and welcome your expertise as we try to deal with significant. So, Smitherman, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chairman Whitfield, Ranking Member Rush, members of the committee, including my good friends from Texas. My name is Barry Smitherman. I'm the chairman of the Texas Railroad Commission. I was elected statewide last November with 74% of the vote, apparently receiving at least 2 votes from this room. The Railroad Commission of Texas was created by an amendment to the Texas Constitution in 1891, and we are the oldest regulatory body in Texas, one of the oldest in America. While we no longer regulate railroads, we have for almost 100 years regulated the oil and natural gas industries. We also regulate intrastate pipelines, surface mining for lignite, and natural gas utility rates. I'm also the former chairman of the Public Utility Commission, as you heard earlier, which regulates the electric and telecommunications industries. In that capacity, I was a member of the ERCOT Board of Directors, which is the grid operator for most of Texas. I'm honored to be the only person in Texas history to serve as commissioner on both the PUC and the Railroad Commission. I'm also the chairman of the NARUC Gas Committee, though I'm not appearing in that capacity today. Today's hearing focuses on natural gas and electric coordination challenges, and my focus in these comments will be on upstream production issues. In analyzing these 2 issues, we must keep in mind 2 significant developments. The first of which has been touched upon is that EPA, under this administration, has ramrodded through a suite of anti-fossil initiatives led by 6 new greenhouse gas rules, which effectively make it impossible to build a new coal plant in America. Texas has refused to comply with these sweeping EPA regulations, and therefore EPA has rejected our permitting authority through the first ever imposition of a Federal Implementation Plan, or FIP. The Texas Attorney General has assured me that he will challenge these greenhouse gas rules in the U.S. Supreme Court if certiorari is granted. When I last appeared before this committee, I spoke of the Cross-State Air Pollution Rule. CSAPR is the successor to the Clean Air Transport Rule, and had it been implemented in early 2012, it would have caused the premature closing of several coal-fired power generation plants in Texas. Such closures would have increased the likelihood of rolling blackouts last summer and this coming summer. Fortunately, Texas and the other litigants were successful at the Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia when the court vacated CSAPR by concluding that the EPA had exceeded its authority. I could talk about the remaining rulemaking initiatives, but I prefer to focus on the second development, which is actually very positive, timely, and quite fortuitous. We now have abundant supplies of natural gas in America. Through horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing techniques developed by the private sector, we've seen a 180-degree turnabout from just 5 years ago. In late 2008, it was believed that we were running out of natural gas in America. And in fact, the price was very high, over $12 an MMBTU, and several firms were considering importing LNG. Today, America is awash in natural gas. And whether it's a 100-year or 200-year supply of natural gas, we have a lot of it, and Texas is leading the way. We produce almost 20 BCF of gas per day, which is about 30% of all U.S. production. The Barnett Shale, for example, has produced 12 trillion cubic feet of gas, and we believe there are 44 trillion cubic feet of gas remaining. The importance of this is that electricity prices in many parts of the country are driven by the price of natural gas. For example, in Dallas, where Chairman Emerita Barton is from, you can get electricity for less than 5 cents a kilowatt hour. 5 cents a kilowatt hour. That's 1/3 of what the price was 5 years ago, almost directly related to the cheap price of natural gas. However, I must point out that there are potential storm clouds on the horizon, whether it's potential endangered species listing, which would take prime gas-producing areas off the table, new source performance standards, new fugitive methane emissions requirements, frac water use studies, and possible restrictions on supply and disposal, overly onerous permitting requirements to fracture a well on federal land. The list goes on, and we could potentially kill the goose that lays the golden egg. In conclusion, I would say new nuclear power construction is prohibitively expensive. Power variable, not yet scalable. Coal-fired power plants are constant from the EPA. Natural gas, the only fuel source that makes electricity today at scale with reasonable prices to the consumer. However, let's be clear, without hydraulic fracturing, this incredible supply of natural gas disappears. Prices of both gas and electricity will skyrocket, and our economy will stop dead in its tracks again. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, and Mr. Gardner, I'll call on you make some comments about our next witness.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I would just like to welcome Chairman Appel to the committee. I've worked with the chairman on a number of issues over the years, and as chairman of the Public Utilities Commission, has jurisdiction over not only some of the regulations that we're talking about here today, but also taxi cabs and all kinds of other fun stuff in Colorado. But certainly appreciate your work as chairman of the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission as well. Welcome to the committee. Thanks for sharing your expertise with us.
Well, thank you, Congressman. Thank you, Chairman Whitfield, Ranking Member Rush, and members of the subcommittee for the opportunity to testify at today's hearing. My name is Joshua E. Pell, and as the Congressman mentioned, I'm the chairman of the Colorado Public Utilities Commission. Prior to my appointment to the commission, I was chairman of the Colorado Oil and Gas Commission, so I understand a little bit of the issues, and we are sort of the baby brother to the Railroad Commission. The state of Colorado began to diversify its source of electric generation in 2005, when it adopted its renewable energy standard through a ballot initiative. Subsequently, the Colorado legislature increased the renewable energy requirement twice with bipartisan support. The Colorado legislature also adopted minimum standards for electricity savings through energy efficiency, resulting in a decrease in the amount of fossil fuel necessary to meet the electric demands of Colorado. In 2010, the Colorado General Assembly did something extraordinary. It passed the Colorado Clean Air Jobs Act. Representative Gardner was a supporter of the act. What made the act remarkable and instructive for today's hearing is the act mandated that the state's largest investor-owned utility undertake a process of significantly reducing its coal usage in Colorado. And most importantly, certainly to me, is the legislature did not mandate the fuel mix, but left that decision to the Colorado Public Utilities Commission. The decision adopted by the Commission and ultimately approved by EPA is instructive on a way to meet the challenge of natural gas and electric coordination, and also to meet the potential EPA regulations for existing generation sources. First, The Air Quality Control Division, our regulatory agency in Colorado, was instructed to aid the Commission. And second, it was the Commission that determined the correct mix of fuel switching to natural gas, plant retirement, and retrofitting of existing coal-fired units. The plan adopted by the Commission will allow our largest utility to be in compliance with the Regional Haze Rule, the Mercury and Air Toxics Rule, and reduce greenhouse gases by 30% by 2020 from 2005 levels. By the very nature of the plan, the cost will be reasonable and ensure that we have safe and reliable electric generation in Colorado. A central element of this plan is Colorado has made a conscious decision to switch some generation, not all, from coal to gas. We are assured that we will not have a conflict with electric and gas generation because Public Service Company of Colorado signed a 10-year long-term contract with a gas producer in Colorado. Now, at this point, I've got to be fair to the other regions. Colorado is unique. We have a surplus of gas, and we also have an existing pipeline infrastructure that allowed that signing of a long-term contract. But this program does not come without a cost to Colorado. The estimated price tag of Clean Air, Clean Jobs is around $900 million. Colorado will also be required to make additional infrastructure changes and, as was asked in the previous questions, assure the safety of the gas distribution system. As the members of the subcommittee know, an additional challenge for the electric generation system will be EPA's rules for existing sources. I believe Colorado's approach provides a lesson on how to address existing and future rules. However, to be successful, key principles must be observed. The Clean Air, Clean Jobs Act enabled Colorado to meet numerous federal air quality requirements. And because the Commission selected a suite of controls, fuel switching and plant retirements, and what we did is we examined the entire fleet of Public Service Company. Each generation plant controlled individually, it would have been prohibitively expensive and politically impossible. By being technology agnostic, Colorado set the right balance of fuel switching, retirement, and retrofits to provide both the necessary reductions and keep rates reasonable and the system safe and reliable. Finally, implementation of the Renewable Energy Standard and Clean Air, Clean Jobs Act is a major investment. As EPA develops its new rules for existing sources, if Colorado is not given credit for this investment, it will be penalized unfairly when compared to states that have not taken early action. Thank you for the honor of representing Colorado before the subcommittee, and I'll be pleased to answer any questions.
Thanks very much, Mr. Epple. Mr. Moeller, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Whitfield, Ranking Member Rush. Thank you for the opportunity today to present before this committee. I'm Claire Moeller, the Executive Vice President of Transmission Technology for the Midwest ISO, or MISO. We are a nonprofit public interest organization charged with operating a wholesale market in the states we serve, as well as ensuring reliability to the consumers. It's important that we guard both the reliability and consumer costs as we work our way through those issues. My task as a planner for the Midwest ISO is to be the early warning system to ensure that consumers have both low cost and high reliability at the end of the day. To protect that, we look towards various scenarios about how the effect of changing policies might reduce reliability or increase costs for our customers. Recent economic and regulatory pressure is having the effect of reducing excess capacities in the Midwest. Historically, we were blessed with an excessive capacity, which frankly made the reliability job fairly easy. These pressures, we believe, by the end of the day, will have reduced our coal fleet by approximately 18%. That will bring our required reserve margins to their minimum level. The low cost of gas, in addition to these regulatory pressures, are what are driving those retirements in the older coal fleet. Almost 90% of the resulting fleet will have to be retrofitted to comply with the rules. Our concern at that point is accommodating those outages simultaneously as we reach the end of the compliance period. It's important to note that the gas industry and the electric industry have grown up very differently. The flexibility that we require on the gas industry is simply not part of the design requirement of the historic gas infrastructure. So our best friend in the electric business is a simple cycle combustion turbine because it is very fast and very flexible. It's the hardest thing for gas pipelines to manage because it changes their pressure so quickly and has the prospect of having an unannounced start. So the two industries have different requirements in terms of flexibility, and part of the friction between the two industries that we're working our way through is about how to manage the flexibility that, for example, renewable portfolios have caused electricity markets to need to be more flexible. We're trying to reflect that need for flexibility into what we're asking the gas industry to do. That mismatch between the electric industry and the gas industry is both the infrastructure is designed, the gas infrastructure is designed around long-term firm contracts with fairly slow changes in terms of what the off-takes are. The electricity now has a 5-minute market. We price electricity every 5 minutes. Gas typically has a day that closes around 9 o'clock, and you wait another day in order to make significant changes. So it's both the pipeline capacity needs to be engineered to accommodate the flexibility, and the market rules need to be engineered to accommodate the flexibility. In that regard, the MISO is working with the FERC, our state commissions, through an organization of MISO states, which is essentially a representative from each state that we serve. The load-serving entities, which at the end of the day have the interface with the customers. The gas pipelines, who have been very accommodating in terms of beginning this conversation, as well as the gas suppliers, so we can look to what these issues are in aggregate in hopes of achieving a single solution that both protects consumers from unnecessarily high cost and maintains the reliability of the system, which after all is a public safety matter that we all must guard. With that, I look forward to your questions.
Thanks very much. And Mr. Van Wiley, you're recognized for 5 minutes. Be sure and turn them.
Yep. Thank you. Chairman Whitfield, Ranking Member Rush, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you very much for the opportunity to appear before the subcommittee this morning. My name is Gordon Van Wiley. I'm the President and CEO of ISO New England. Today I plan to highlight the serious operational challenges facing New England's power system. In the past decade, natural gas has become the predominant fuel used to produce electricity in New England. However, the limitations of the current market design and the consequent inadequate fuel arrangements by natural gas and oil-fired generation have led to serious reliability threats to the bulk power system. Therefore, we are moving at an urgent pace to develop short and long-term plans to address these issues, primarily through changes to New England's wholesale electricity markets. New England has seen a major shift in its generation fleet, from a diverse mix of oil, coal, nuclear, and natural gas generators to a system where more than half of the region's electricity is produced by power plants using natural gas. In addition, we are observing the retirement of coal and oil generators and the introduction of a diverse set of renewable and demand resources. Wholesale electricity prices are now primarily driven by natural gas-fired generation. The natural gas and electric industries operate under different structures, but are increasingly interdependent. Electricity supply and demand must be balanced on an instantaneous basis, and problems on the electric system require immediate action, often through the operation of fast-responding gas generators. However, if generators have not contracted for gas prior to the electric operating day, the gas system may not be able to respond to the real-time, instantaneous demands of the electric system. For power grid reliability to be maintained, we need to have adequate levels of fuel inventory within the region, either through storage or reliable transportation arrangements so that the electric sector is ready to respond whenever called on by the ISO. Those arrangements should be incentivized through changes to the wholesale electricity market design so as to provide strong economic signals for generators to perform when needed. It is likely that this will result in incrementally higher wholesale prices in order to pay for the improved reliability that we seek. New England cannot access the full benefit of the domestic shale gas deposits because of pipeline constraints leading into New England from both the west and the south. The interstate natural gas pipelines operate under a business and regulatory model that requires a long-term firm commitment by the pipeline customer. Because the current wholesale electricity market design does not provide gas generators with the necessary performance incentives, we have found that generators often do not make arrangements to ensure that they have an adequate and reliable fuel supply for the output of their facilities. The region has historically relied on its oil and coal generation to provide fuel diversity and offset the operational risks associated with a constrained gas transportation system. However, the confluence of low wholesale market prices, high oil prices, and increasing environmental costs is causing these generators to retire and or limit the output of fuel inventory that they carry. Thus, our dependence on gas generation is poised to increase and our operational options are becoming more limited. The New England states are studying the ability of the natural gas pipeline system to satisfy both heating and electric market demand in the region. These efforts are intended to provide information to policymakers and market participants on a range of possible solutions to deficiencies in natural gas infrastructure. This winter, New England did not experience record or sustained cold temperatures or unusually high demand for electricity. However, wholesale electricity prices rose significantly during this period because of physical constraints moving the lowest priced natural gas into New England. During that period, as well as during a significant winter storm in early February, ISO operators had to cope with multiple instances where generators could not get fuel to run. Our experiences this winter lead us to conclude that the status quo is not sustainable. ISO New England is working with the New England states and its stakeholders to develop market changes to provide the economic incentives necessary to ensure that generators have adequate and reliable fuel supplies. Additional flexibility in the natural gas industry would also help address the challenges of increasing interdependency between the two industries. The gas sector could assist with reliability efforts if gas suppliers provided generators with additional opportunities to obtain fuel outside of normal business hours, and if pipelines would offer more flexible scheduling, additional services, and provide real-time information on the status of the pipeline system. In the long run, it would be helpful for the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission to improve the operational alignment between the electric and gas systems. In conclusion, we recognize that we have to address these issues with a sense of urgency. Discussions are underway with our stakeholders, and we'll be making multiple filings at the FERC over the next 12 months to address the many components of our action plan. Thank you, and I look forward to your question.
Thanks very much. And Mr. Hibbard, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Ranking member and members of the committee, for the opportunity to testify before you today. Challenges associated with of natural and electric important from both the perspectives of electricity and natural gas users throughout the U.S. and from the perspectives of reliability and cost. So considering these issues now is both appropriate and very well timed. So let me summarize my view on coordination issues with just 5 key points. First, we shouldn't forget the benefits of improved coordination, and we should focus on it. As a former chairman of the Public Utility Commission in Massachusetts, at a time when natural gas prices were both very high and very volatile, I want to emphasize the consumer rationale for better coordination. The emergence of shale gas has dramatically lowered the cost of living and doing business across many states and has generated significant economic benefits. When considering coordination challenges, this should be front and center. We need to improve coordination because that will allow electric ratepayers to realize the benefits that our expanded domestic natural gas resource base represents. Adding new gas-fired generating capacity to a region can lower costs, expand use of a domestic fuel, provide environmental benefits, and facilitate the integration of variable renewable resources. Improving the stability and efficiency of electric gas market transactions must thus be viewed not as a challenge but as an opportunity. The second point I want to make is that power grids can be operated reliably with a significant reliance on natural gas, with a critical caveat that I'll mention in a minute. Heavy reliance on natural gas-fired generation does not, by definition, diminish the reliability of power grid operations. New and efficient gas-generating technologies can provide numerous reliability advantages. They are relatively easy to develop and site, can be built in various sizes and configurations, and can be located close to where electrical load is. They offer the ability for continuous operation, faster startup, and faster response to grid-operated dispatch instructions that over many competing resource types. Finally, as our states seek to integrate vast amounts of renewable resources, gas-fired power plants offer the best physical operating characteristics for managing the variability associated with these sources. The third point I want to make is the critical caveat is that natural gas infrastructure must be sufficient to meet the coincident demands of heating, industrial processes, and electric generation at all times. In the time frame of short-run transactions between electric and natural gas markets, the prevailing profit motives of market participants are extremely effective at overcoming short-term supply and transportation issues, but they simply cannot overcome physical constraints on the flow of gas. In some regions, gas infrastructure is or will become increasingly constrained, particularly in the winter. Where pipeline and LNG infrastructure is sized primarily to meet winter heating demands, there is limited space on the region's pipelines to carry gas for electricity generation during cold winter conditions. Addressing this is the fundamental challenge of the coordination issues before us today. Fourth, given these circumstances, in regions with inadequate natural gas infrastructure, grid operators and regulators must focus on relieving these infrastructure constraints and, in the meantime, ensuring reliable operations in the face of constraints. Grid operators need to ensure that under adverse power system conditions, including constraints on the flow of gas for power generation, there is sufficient capacity to reliably operate the system. There are a number of tools operators can use to accomplish this, such as retaining non-gas units needed for reliability, requiring switching at units that have dual fuel capability, dispatching resources that otherwise might be uneconomic, calling on demand response resources, and activating operating procedures where necessary to avoid power disruptions. In addition, regulators and grid operators can take actions to relieve prevailing constraints in the longer term through regulatory orders and market structures that promote development of dual fuel capability, enhanced demand response, or investment in new natural gas transportation infrastructure where it's economic. Finally, in regions that currently have adequate natural gas infrastructure, operators and regulators must not let down their guard. Their decisions and actions are key to appropriately planning for avoiding such infrastructure constraints in the future. In short, regulators and grid operators play vital roles in advancing the coordination of natural gas and electric markets, in promoting the development of needed natural gas system infrastructure, and in managing the reliable operation of power systems in the face of supply constraints. Given the potential economic reliability and environmental benefits of expanded use of natural gas in the electric sector, the efforts of regulators in this area should receive heightened attention. And so I want to thank you. Forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Hibbard, and I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes of questions. Mr. Van Wiley, recently the New York Times wrote an article about the power shortages in the Northeast, and I know Commissioner LaFleur in her testimony pointed out the Northeast as an area of concern, as did you in your testimony. Now, the New York Times article focused a lot on nuclear power, and I would ask, of course, you've got the Vermont Yankee plant, you've got the Indian Point plant. Both of them, there are groups trying to shut them down. If that occurred, what impact would that have upon the Northeast and its ability to generate enough electricity?
So both New York and New England have got market mechanisms for replacing that capacity if those 2 nuclear generators were to retire. So I can't predict with precision what will replace it, but it does seem like the most economic resource to replace that capacity would be additional gas-fired generation. So it would create additional stress on the gas system.
Well, do you have any concerns about blackouts or brownouts in the immediate future?
We do. We got dangerously close this winter, and hence we are moving with a sense of urgency. I think it's all about making sure that in this transition period, we will have to rely on oil and coal generation and LNG imports into the region. And so the reason I say that is it's going to take 3 to 5 years to build new pipeline into New England. So we are going to be in a situation where we have to optimize the use of existing infrastructure within the region. And so we're working closely with our stakeholders to try and identify interim mechanisms to bridge this transition period.
Yeah, and we also appreciate in your testimony you're setting out some specific things that needed to be done, which we appreciate your setting that out as well. Mr. Apple, in your testimony, I was trying to find it real quick here. You made a comment, and I may be paraphrasing, maybe I can find it real quick, but you made a comment that Congress and EPA must acknowledge that it is the exclusive province of the Utility Commission to determine the mix of strategies to achieve standards at EPA. And recently, we had 3 forums on the Clean Air Act, and regulators came in from all over the country, and many of them expressed some concerns about their flexibility. So would you elaborate on this just a little bit?
Certainly. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My concern is I believe we have to have a bifurcated system for EPA or the Congress to establish what are the goals, what are the targets. But really when it comes down to who's going to have the capability of making decisions, looking at the entire system, for example, with Colorado, what plants should be retrofitted, which ones should have fuel switching, how much energy efficiency can we utilize? That's really the expertise of the state commissions or the regional bodies. And that's a complex equation not only of the air quality impacts, but the financial impacts, how much infrastructure has to be built. I think really it's the state commissions or the regional bodies which have that intricate understanding of the system. And so neither Congress or EPA really can delve into that level of detail. They certainly can say, here's the goal, here's the slope of how quickly it has to be achieved. But when it gets down to the real nitty-gritty of economically making these decisions, so we balance both the environmental needs and the financial consideration of the state, I think that's really where our expertise lies.
Okay, thanks. Mr. Smitherman, are there any other states that that EPA has issued a federal implementation plan for, other than Texas?
Not aware of them.
Okay. And of course, you won your permit case also across state as well, right?
We did know that the EPA did in an arbitrary and capricious manner with regard to our flex permitting program.
Mm-hmm. Now, you testified regarding wind power, subsidizing wind power, and you talked a little bit about wind generators bidding negative prices into the ERCOT and how that distorts the system. Would you just be negative thing?
I will. Quick snap. First 2 months this year, 9% gas, 38%, 11% air, and 11% wind. That's been our power mix. With the PTC in effect, wind basically can offer in at negative prices. And because we run a market dispatch model, the cheapest generation, which is wind and nuclear, is dispatched first. So when the wind is blowing, it creates negative prices, basically pushing off of the dispatch curve occasionally gas and coal.
Okay, thank you. My time has expired. I recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Rush, for 5 minutes.
I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to go down the line and just ask each witness a simple question, and maybe it could be answered with a yes or no, because I do have a follow-up question. Do you think that the transition from coal-fired power plants to natural gas is mostly a positive development or a negative development for our nation?
Well, Mr. Rush, I think we need a balance. We need a portfolio, as we have in Texas, because if gas prices were to rise back to their 2008 levels, then coal would provide a hedge against that. When gas prices are low, then gas is the right thing to dispatch. So if you put all your eggs in one basket, you run the risk of having not a portfolio, but a situation which doesn't give you any options.
Yeah.
Mr. Rush, I would say in the affirmative, the transition to utilization of gas is a net positive for society and certainly for Colorado. But as Chairman Smitherman said, we do need to keep that diverse portfolio.
Mr. Moeller?
I apologize. I'm going to have to not take a position. Our not-for-profit independent status precludes me from choosing between fuels.
So I think the evidence in New England has been that the transition to natural gas has been a beneficial thing for the region, both from an economic and an environmental point of view. I think to Mr. Hibbett's earlier point, it's vital that we make sure that the fuel infrastructure can support that gas generation.
And I would agree as well that given the economic, environmental, and reliability benefits, the transition is a good one.
Mr. Moeller, in your testimony, you expressed some concerns about the impact of the expected coal plant retirements and retrofits on the MISO reserves of electricity generation capacity. When MISO briefed the committee staff, they focused on the winter of 2016. By that time, most of the retirements would have occurred. MISO said there was a, quote, potential shortfall, end of quote, of 11,700 megawatts of generation capacity at that time. And I know that your job is to keep the lights on, and that means considering the worst case scenario. I can appreciate that, but I want to make sure that the subcommittee gets a realistic picture of some of the resource adequacy situation in MISO. So I'd like to ask you a couple of questions about it, about this potential shortfall. MISO's projection assumed that 3,000 megawatts of new gas capacity would be built over the next 3 to 4 years. That seems to be kind of low. Would you consider that to be a conservative assumption?
That conservative assumption is based on people who have requested to interconnect new gas-fired generation to the MISO transmission system.
As I understand it, MISO's calculation doesn't count any new wind capacity. Is that right?
Wind capacity market, the owner of choose to count it as a 12 capacity for irrigation.
It's an intermittent resource, but it's also the single largest source of new generation capacity last year. A calculation that doesn't account for any new wind capacity may be missing an important piece of that puzzle. The MISO analysis also assumes that almost 19,000 megawatts of natural gas generation wouldn't have the fuel to operate winter of 2016. That's significantly more than the entire, quote, potential shortfall, end of quote. We're hearing a lot today about the challenge of making sure that the natural gas infrastructure is adequate. Do you have any comments about the adequacy of this shortfall?
Yes, sir. The point I was attempting to illustrate in that conversation was that the majority of the gas-fired generation in the MISO market was constructed around a summer utilization, and they did not purchase firm transportation for their gas. In July and August, there is typically sufficient gas and gas transportation to meet those requirements because it is not coincident with the heating load. Our concern is that as we move towards using that gas in the winter periods with the competition for heat load, it is unclear how much that capacity would be available. So our conversation was, it's clear that 100% of that capacity won't be available. It's probably also true that 0 of that capacity would be available. But at this point in time, as we discussed with the gas pipe suppliers, it's unclear how much of that gas we can count on to be there for us in the wintertime. The New England situation is a harbinger of problems we seek to avoid. And so that conversation was to point out how large the problem might be, frankly, sir, to pique people's interest so that we can get a solution in time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The ranking member yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Latta, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you very much. Appreciate it, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much for panel. I'm sorry that this is one of those days we have 2 hearings going on at the exact same time, but we appreciate you being here and joining us. And if I could just go back to Mr. Smitherin, if I could just ask you a few questions. Found your testimony very interesting that you had given. You say on page 1, you say, however, because the federal government and the EPA continue to set unreasonable roadblocks to diverse fuel production, the natural gas industry is challenged to supply enough energy for the nation. And then you go on to state that the EPA has implemented such onerous restrictions on the ability to build new coal plants that it has greatly impacted fuel supply in Texas and the nation. You know, when we were talking about these onerous restrictions, I'm just curious, have you heard of any of the EPA doing any cost basis analysis for the state of Texas, how it would affect you all?
Congressman, I'm not aware of any analysis they've done with regard to the state of Texas, though when they put forward many of these regulations, they proffer certain cost-benefit analysis, and not surprisingly, the benefits in their minds always outweigh the cost. What we have challenged is, what is the cost of failed reliability? What is the cost of not having enough electricity, of the lights going out? And that is a real possibility if we prematurely close down some of our coal-fired power generation plants, or we limit the ability to recover natural gas. Either of those could lead to shortages.
Well, and when we're talking about looking at those issues, and especially when you're talking about coal-fired plants, especially where I'm from, the state of Ohio, that up the northern part of the state, we're well over 60% coal-fired, and you know we're for, as Republicans had said back in 2008, we all want to have an all-of-the-above energy policy that takes in clean coal, natural gas, nuclear, hydro, and all of the alternatives. But we want to make sure that they're out there for the people, because in a question like could be going on here, especially when they're not doing a cost basis analysis, and we're not sure how the impact is. Really, in the end, when you're going to close the plant, who's going to pay for this in the very end?
Well, in regulated markets, if you're retrofitting these coal plants to come into compliance with everything except carbon capture, which is another technology altogether, then the ratepayers are going to pay for them. If you're talking about in deregulated or competitive markets, then you're going to see many of these plants close down, which is going to end up giving us a fuel mix which is heavily weighted toward natural gas, which is great if natural gas prices stay low and the supply remains high.
Well, and again, in the state of Ohio, we've been very fortunate that with the Utica Shale being found, and it's actually some geological surveys have been done recently. They're actually moving farther across the state, which, it's great, but you're right, we have to have that blend out there. And the thing that I worry about is that, like in my district, I have 60,000 manufacturing jobs, and we have to have baseload capacity to make sure that when the big machines go on in the morning or at night, that they stay on, and we want to make sure that folks can compete out there. Mr. Mueller, if I could just move over to ask you, you were talking about some things up in the Northeast, but what about in the Midwest when you look at, when you're looking at heating and taking precedence over electric generation, should the two compete for natural resources? What do you see about the Midwest and how things could be impacted?
So we've got a very complicated situation in the 21 different interstate pipelines serve the Midwest region. Each one of those pipelines has a different set of fact circumstances in terms of how constrained they are, but all of them were constructed on a subscription basis around residential heat load. So we continue to be concerned that as we begin to rely more on gas, more in the winter months, we will see conflicts around competition for that gas pipeline capacity. We're trying to understand what that conflict might look like across those 21 gas pipes to see what the cost to consumers might be.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. McInerney.
Thank you,
5
Mr.
minutes.
Chairman. I've heard this morning and today a lot about pipeline infrastructure being inadequate or flexibility. I haven't heard anything about storage. Is storage a viable option for local utilities? Can they build storage for natural gas, or is there some reason why that's not on the table? Whoever wants to answer it.
Historically, there has been some natural gas storage in local distribution companies in the form of small liquid natural gas.
Right.
There are also geologic opportunities to store, but they are not universally available across the entire country, sir.
Mr. Manuel?
So I presume your question was with regard to electrical storage as opposed to fuel storage.
Natural gas storage.
Yeah, so I think the most practical solution, at least for our region in terms of fuel storage, is LNG. And there are some large LNG facilities around the region, and I think that ultimately the solution is a combination of pipeline and storage, because one has to think of the possibility that a pipeline could be compromised in some way, and you need to be able to ride through that event. And one way of dealing with that is through local storage.
Is storage more expensive than pipelines? Or
Typically, yes. I think LNG, from some of the numbers that I've seen, it's the energy required in order to compress and liquefy the gas makes it relatively expensive compared to the gas in the pipe.
Okay, thank you. So what would be the best way then, Mr. Van Welle, to get the flexibility you need for reliability from natural gas?
So I think it depends where you are, and if you're in a restructured wholesale electricity market, such as exists in New England, what we need to do is to make sure that the incentives for our generators are such that they will seek reliable fuel supplies. They will then have a number of options open to them. So, for example, if we have created a strong performance incentive for them and they're out there looking for reliable fuel supply, they could choose to put in dual fuel infrastructure, a tank of oil, and switch from gas to oil if the gas system becomes constrained, or they could enter into a bilateral contract with an LNG storage provider to draw gas from the LNG storage facility, or contract with the pipelines for no-notice service or firm service from the pipes. So I think the starting point in solving this problem is to have the generators feel like they have to have adequate fuel in order to meet the core of the ISO.
So in other words, sort of free market approach with the right incentive.
That's right. Dictate what their solution is. We just want them to produce electrical energy when we need them to.
Mr. Muller, I think it was you that mentioned there was a conflict between when certain natural gas pipelines are only approved to deliver during certain periods of time. Does that sound familiar?
No. I was commenting about the fact that gas pipelines are constructed typically based on a subscription form of service where the original owners of the gas capacity have typically been residential heat loads. And so the pipe has been sized based on the original use. And typically those original users, it's 20 years gone by since those pipes have been constructed. So it's unclear in terms of how much capacity is available during what times of the year to supply this new use.
So that wasn't a contractual issue more than as a physical capacity issue?
It's two issues. One is the physical issue and the other is a contractual issue. And because they are both fairly opaque, it's a little hard to figure out what the actual fact circumstance is.
Do you have the resources to make that work better?
We've engaged with the natural gas pipelines that serve our region, and they are working with us to answer those questions.
Okay. Mr. Epple, you mentioned that you felt Colorado was ahead of the curve on these issues. What has given Colorado that sort of wherewithal to get into that position?
Congressman, this was actually driven by the voters of Colorado. Our renewable energy portfolio was really adopted by a ballot initiative, which the legislature then enhanced. And there's been a consistent desire for Colorado to have as much fuel diversification as possible. We spend quite a bit of time on energy efficiency also to reduce overall fuel usage. But it really comes from the voters of Colorado. They've spoken pretty clearly on this topic.
Okay, thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. The chairman, applying the gavel-in rule, recognizes himself for 5 minutes. And first, I'd like to welcome all of you for coming, but a very special welcome for the chairman of the Texas Railroad Commission, a man I voted for this past November, Chairman Barry Smitherman. And as they say in College Station, Texas, home of the Fighting Texas Aggies, howdy, whoop. As Commissioner Smith, and this question is for you, as you discuss your testimony, Texas very clearly has reliability challenges ahead of it, starting as early as next year when resource reserve margins could slip below the 13.75 target that ERCOT has. And while FERC works to address the impacts of increasingly depending on natural gas, would you agree that on the other side of Washington, the EPA is working to help make it all but impossible to build any new coal plants that would diversify our power sources?
Certainly, Congressman Olson, great to see you. You referenced earlier in your remarks a couple of projects which had been taken off the table in Texas because they were unable to meet new federal greenhouse gas regulations. So what that leaves us with in Texas is maintaining the current coal fleet and hoping that generators will add additional combined cycle gas. It looks like we're going to get a couple of new projects built that are going to be combined cycle, but probably going forward, that is the only type of generation that we'll see built in Texas will be combined cycle gas. And with that, we are trying to design a market to incent additional generation, but we essentially have found ourselves with only one tool in the toolbox.
And what tool is that, sir?
That is modifying the market design to incent new natural gas-fired generation. Since we will not get any new coal plants built, we will struggle to maintain the existing coal fleet operational, and I think it's almost impossible to build new nuclear in Texas.
Yes, sir. I understand all that. And you heard my exchange with Commissioner Moeller in the previous panel about the incident in February of 2011, the Fulton incident across our state, and also the heat wave in the state as well. Our year. The February 2000 has been a while now is a clear example of the interdependence of the electrical and natural gas industries and what can happen with systems when they run into trouble. That Texas learned from that, and so alongside PUC that they can be shared nationwide.
Learned and one that among all these is incredibly important. So we have a task force today that meets regularly to investigate and communicate issues of fuel supply, of weatherization. In fact, one of the things we required after that event was additional weatherization on the boiler level to make sure that these plants are prepared for extraordinarily cold weather, and to encourage firm gas supply contracts to our power generating stations. And if we know that a firm supply contract is not in place, that the ERCOT grid operators do not count upon that unit to be available during those periods of time. We're also working on demand response initiatives and other things that give us a few additional tools. But I think it's important to be mindful of the fact that that was a very, very cold weather event. And for the most part, power generation plants in Texas are designed for summer heat, not for sub-32-degree temperatures for 3 straight days.
Yes, sir. And one final question. This is taking a page from Chairman Emeritus Dingell's playbook, but I'm asking a question for all of you with an answer of yes or no. Start with you, Mr. Hibbert, on the end there. Yes or no. As things stand now, do you see the need for a full FERC rulemaking on the topic of gas-electric coordination, or is a focus on regional action and clarification of existing regulations enough? Yes or no, please, sir.
I think FERC's approach looking at the issue regionally is correct.
And Mr. Van der Walle.
I think it's yes and no. So I think most of this can be handled regionally, but I think there are certain issues that that Commissioner LaFleur indicated could be looked at nationally.
Yeah, I guess I should rephrase that. Regional or FERC regulation? Mr. Moeller.
Regional.
Regional. Mr. Eppel.
Regional.
Mr. Smitherman.
Texans can take care of Texas.
Amen, brother. Well, Mr. Hibbard, regional, sounds like you're regional as well. Okay, there you go. So 5 for 5. Looks like I'm out of time. I yield back the balance of my time. Recognize the gentleman from New York. The Chairman Mayor slipped in here behind me. Mr. Dingley, ready to ask some questions, sir? Okay, then we'll move on to my colleague from Texas, Mr. Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I know some of my questions of our Chair of the Railroad Commission, and his earlier hat was on the Public Utility Commission. I can't make the same statement that I voted for him last fall, but I did vote for his mom a few times. But Barry, it's good to see you, and I know as a Railroad Commission you have a different hat on in the Public Utility Commission, and I appreciate all your work on the PUC, because at one time, and that you heard my questions earlier, we're proud in Texas to have ERCOT, and we've never had a reliability issue. And I know we've been wrestling it on what we can do to, you don't want to burden ratepayers too much, but you also don't want to have some of the incidents we have. And believe me, I would, in D.C., we protect ERCOT on bipartisan basis. You talked about expansion of coal plants in Texas, and I know EPA, when they did the carbon rule, it was for future plants, not current plants, on carbon for sequestration for coal. In all honesty, I can't imagine building a coal plant unless you actually did like we did in Texas with lignite right over it. The economics seem like with natural gas, if you have access to natural gas, you wouldn't build a coal plant even if the EPA extended that rule to coal plants. Is that true?
Well, first, let me say I'd hope that you would have voted for me because I didn't have a Democrat in my race. So let's remember that we have a lot of mine-mouth coal in Texas, and actually today mine-mouth coal is economic when compared to gas at $3.80 gas prices. So we want to make sure we keep those units running, and that was really the thrust of our pushback on Casper. We were afraid that several
congratulations, because that was a part of some of our hearings over the last few years on the transport rule, which never made sense to me. And I grew up there, and the wind comes from the south at certain times of the year, it comes from the north, but I never knew it went to Indiana. But be that may, and
neither. I think the important thing is to maintain optionality. We're in our market. Not only do we run a competitive wholesale market, but we also have munis and co-ops like San Antonio and Austin, as well as fully regulated companies on the periphery of the ERCOT market. And for them, the option to build new coal, even if it's Powder River Basin coal, could be an important consideration. So we want to make sure that we don't have such onerous greenhouse gas regulations that building new coal, unless it has CCS, is completely off the table. Gas prices are low now. That's great. We're long gas. It's terrific. And I would just remind, though, that gas prices have gone from $1.99 to $3.80 over the last 2 years. I think they'll stabilize somewhere in the $4 to $5.50 range. At that point, it becomes probably a break-even for coal. So again, having that balance, and we have a really nice balance right now, I think is important for consumers.
Okay. I know when you talked about nuclear, and we would have gotten our nuclear loan guarantees in South Texas. We only have the two plants, Glen Rose and South Texas, except for financial problems of one of the investors was Tokyo Power, and after Fukushima, Japan wasn't going to send us $125 million, but I know nuclear needs to be part of ours along with our success in natural gas. I'm curious, because you've had both hats on, both on the Railroad Commission and the PUC. Is there a market structure that we can do that under ERCOT, that working both with your example from the Railroad Commission with regulation of oil and gas and PUC, to have that reliability we've become accustomed to in Texas?
I'd say several things are important. One, we need an upstream supply, robust supply of all the resources. Two, we need to build midstream infrastructure, pipelines, and transmission lines. And then we need to continue to tinker with the market design to incent new generation. You know, the ERCOT market it's like an airplane ride. You take mid-course corrections along the way till you get to your destination. You don't put it on autopilot. and I'm confident that the current commissioners are doing that.
Well, and I understand. I've been through Eagle Ford and seeing the amount of gas we're flaring. Of course, nothing compared to what they're doing in North Dakota. So that infrastructure is really important because I know those producers would rather have somebody buying that gas than it would be just flaring it. So the pipeline's important. Mr. Van Wiley, in New England, how many LNG import facilities? I'm well aware of the one in Boston Harbor. That's been a debate in our committee for many years. Are there other LNG facilities in New England?
There are two buoys in the ocean off Boston, which I don't think they've ever been utilized, maybe once. But the other one that's sort of a dominant resource for the region is in New Brunswick in Canada. So it's owned by Repsol, and they have 10 BCF of storage just across the Maine border.
About a dozen years ago, I kept hearing the Austin to Boston connection with natural gas. Is there not enough pipeline capacity to send some of that Eagle Ford gas instead of flaring it up to Boston?
That's the basic problem. So the pipelines from the west and the south are fully utilized.
And there's not enough new subscriptions because, as my colleagues, people don't build a pipeline unless they have customers. And if you want to expand the pipeline, you need to have those customers committed to that because, it's an investment. And is there not enough potential expansion for those to expand those pipelines where we have the natural gas?
Yeah, so there's a regulatory, what I call a regulatory conundrum here. On the one hand, you have the electric sector in the wholesale markets where generators are thinking short to medium term at best. So year by year, sometimes day to day. The pipelines they will only build the pipe if they get somebody to commit to them for 15, 20 years. So how do you actually make those two business models work together?
Mr. Chairman, one last question. How long is that LNG?
The gentleman's time has expired. And the only reason I point that out is because you do have a chairman emeritus who is waiting patiently to question.
Far be it from me to stand in the way of the...
This member is not complaining.
This member is complaining.
Well, if I could just, you don't have to answer, just how long has that LNG import facility been in Boston Harbor?
You don't have to answer.
Yeah, about 20 years.
You could probably build a pipeline. Thank you.
I thank the gentleman for yielding back. Chair now recognizes himself, however time he wants, for questions.
Chairman,
And
you are a good friend, always remarkably courteous, I think.
I actually recognize myself, Mr. Chairman.
I thought you were...
I referred to myself as chairman because
well,
I think there's an aspirational goal involved here. I do want to thank the member that stood with us so long today, Mr. Smitherman, and I'm going to join the parade. I voted for you as well. I voted for myself, coincidentally, on the same day. But I'm going to ask you, but really the question may be one that could be answered or should be answered by everyone on the panel. National Geographic cover story this week or last week was America Strikes Oil. I realize the cover is a little incendiary, a little inflammatory, to coin a pun there. But, for me, it was phenomenal to sit in the State of the Union address 3 years ago and have the President of the United States wax eloquently over the benefits of fracking and how important that was to our economy and ignore his Affordable Care Act, which he had worked so hard to get. But I think it bespeaks how important this activity is for the future of our economy. In the budget on which we will be voting in just a few hours, Chairman Ryan from the Budget Committee has placed the number in the budget for the future development of natural gas on federal lands, and I realize that's not really Texas, but on federal lands of $11 billion for the next 10 years. That strikes me as an awfully light figure for what really should be a real boon to the American economy.
Well, Dr. Burgess, it's phenomenal what is happening in the oil and gas patch these days. And again, it's all driven by technology, horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing. We're now producing 1.5, 1.6 million barrels a day of crude oil in Texas. That's more than the rest of the country gets from Saudi Arabia. That number could double or triple within the next 10 years, and literally we could be energy secure in America by 2020. That will quickly displace imported oil from Africa, from the Middle East, and ultimately from Russia. So America is on the cusp of having energy security, and with that, great paying jobs and revenue streams that you speak of staying here in America.
Does anyone else on the panel have a feeling as to whether or not that $11 billion figure from oil and gas produced on federal lands, does that seem high, low, or just about right?
Let me just add, this biennium in Texas, oil and gas severance taxes will be over $7 billion just from Texas private lands. So that seems to me like a low number.
Is that $7 billion for 1 year or for 10 years?
For the biennium, for 2 years.
For 2 years, okay. Does anyone else have a sense as $11 billion high, low, or? And again, that's a 10-year figure that's calculated in our budget. I rather think those numbers will be much more robust. Ms. Smitherman, you're correct to point out, and I'm in absolute agreement that Texas is unique unto itself. There are aspects of the Texas oil and gas production that are unique to Texas because of our geology. And the efforts of the Environmental Protection Agency to write rules for the entire country, recognizing that Mr. Eppel's home state of Colorado is vastly different geologically from our home state of Texas. Do you have a feeling as to where those regulations should be written and enforced? Is it at the state level or is it the federal level?
Certainly, we believe at the state level. Railroad Commission employees and TCEQ employees know the underground geology of Texas better than regulators either in Washington, D.C. or with the EPA. We've been at this for over 100 years, and I think the proof is in the pudding. The amount of oil and gas that we produce and our safety record and our environmental stewardship is a real testimony to the fact that we're proud of what we do and we want to take every proactive step to maintain it. In fact, as you recall, we passed the first frac fluid disclosure rule in Texas 2 years ago. We're on the cusp, and next week we will adopt a recycling rule for flowback water. We think will be one of the first, and some additional well integrity rules. So we're actually being proactive.
And you bring up an excellent point, although the concept of horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing was, if I recall correctly, part of that was developed in the Barnett Shale, my home county of Denton County, and has been extrapolated worldwide. But the technology changes, and the technology that's available, not the technology that was available 5, 15 years ago. I'm grateful that that point, because I think as your office there has been in addressing some of the environmental concerns that have occurred as a consequence of this very, very valuable energy source. And then just to wrap up, the economy with the benefit of spectroscope were able to set a recession started in December 2006. The area that represents overlying shale butted in the neighbor because we didn't feel it for almost 14 months. Now, yes, the natural gas price eventually came down to under $2, as you pointed out, and the effect on the job market was felt. But it was astounding, the economic effect of the Barnett Shale in the area of North Texas that I represent. And my only wish is we could see that economic benefit be extrapolated to the rest of the country. And I'm going to yield at this point to the Chairman Emeritus of the full committee, such time as he may consume.
I repeat what I said. You're always very courteous, and I thank you for your kindness. These questions for Mr. Moeller. Mr. Moeller, as utilities build new natural gas electric generating facilities, they retire older coal-fired plants and retrofit other coal-fired plants to comply with EPA regulations such as the Mercury Rule. Do you believe that the Midwest region will have the capacity necessary in terms of electrical generation to meet the demand?
Yes, sir.
Now, is more time needed for compliance under the Mercury Rule to give time for new gas infrastructure and generation to be built?
There may be a small number of projects that will require additional time as they work their way through the construction process.
I'd appreciate it if you would add some remarks for the record later and on these 2 points.
Yes, sir.
Now, sir, in your in her testimony, Commissioner LaFleur said that FERC has been told that the need for infrastructure is a regional issue that requires regional solutions. You also noted that to keep up with demand, the current system will need to be expanded. Given demands for natural gas, both now and projected in the future, how long do you anticipate it will take to build the infrastructure necessary to serve the Midwest region?
Typically, construction of natural gas pipeline takes between 3 and 5 years. It will take us on the order of 3 years to understand what pipelines we should ask for.
Now, how do we add also to that some permitting time? Because pipelines are not always greeted with vast acclaim when somebody comes forward.
3 years is the quick time, and 5 years is if there are permitting issues that need to be worked through, sir.
Now, what will the approximate cost be for this new infrastructure?
Our first guess at that cost would be in the range of $3 to $5 billion.
Now, who will ultimately bear the burden of these costs? The ratepayers, the utilities, the owners of the pipeline?
Ratepayers, at the end of the day, pay for the infrastructure, sir.
And that's a standard rule. That just always happens.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Now, in your testimony, you note that given the nature of pipeline contracts with utilities, some natural gas-fired plants cannot run to provide additional generation during certain peak events. Do you believe that there are changes to be made to ensure utilities have the contracts in place that provide the supply they need to run longer? Please answer yes or no.
Yes.
Would you like to add to that for the record later, if you please?
We can do that, yes, sir.
Now, with improved weather forecasting and the increased use of wind to generate electricity, do you believe that this and other forms of renewable electricity should be included in resource adequacy predictions? Yes or no?
Yes.
And would you submit to us your comments as to why this would be so for the record?
Yes, sir.
Mr. Chairman, you've been most gracious. Thank you to our panel. And I'd just like to make one observation. I've been dealing with these energy questions for years and years and years. And the free economic system always surprises us by how well it works, but it has a lot of other surprises in it for us. And technology seems to change under our feet. We find that where we were anticipating shortages, we all of a sudden have abundance. Where we anticipated abundance, we all of a sudden have shortages. And I just worry constantly about the way things change under our feet and how it is we must see to it that we're ready when the next set of difficulties comes upon us, whether we get gas lines or winters, shutdowns, and the gas pipelines crater, and we have all kinds of troubles. And I'm hopeful that the nice picture that I see today is one which is going to be as nice or nicer tomorrow. But having been a little like the dog that backed into the hot stove, I'm not backing into any stoves, hot or cold, right now. So having said these things, your additional comments for the record would be appreciated. Mr. Chairman, I thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dingell. At this time, I recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Griffith, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate all of you all being here today and appreciate the testimony that I have heard. I think that Mr. Dingell's comments in regard to the circumstances are always changing is one of the reasons that I feel so strongly that we ought not throw coal out or treat coal as if it were a bad word, because long term we know we've got plenty of coal. May be a little harder to get out, but if we run into circumstances that we need it, it's there, and we just need to make sure we have the capabilities when we need it to be able to use it. Likewise, it's great that we have natural gas at fairly reasonable prices, and that you know, I do anticipate one of our, in a previous hearing, and some of you may have heard this earlier, witness indicated that they thought it was going to actually hit $4 by the end of the year. At that point, coal does become competitive again, and then the question becomes, you know, who wants to use it, and are they going to be allowed to use it by regulations? And I would ask you all, and I don't care who wants to volunteer to answer this question, but we hear a lot about retrofitting some of the coal plants, which is a good thing, and some coal plants are fairly new. In light, though, of some of the new regulations that are out there, notwithstanding some comments this week that the White House may back off of some of the greenhouse gas regulations in regard to power plants, how likely is it that you all would, or that you anticipate that your power producers are going to be anxiously looking to find ways to retrofit coal plants in light of the uncertainty that's out there with what they might have to do with CO2? You want to start, Mr. Smitherman?
Yeah, Congressman, you raise a great issue because that's the unknown. You could retrofit to capture SO2, mercury, particulate matter, everything else that goes up that flue except for CO2, and then find yourself 5 or 10 years from now having to make a major retrofit to capture carbon, or it'd be cost prohibitive and you just have to close the plant down, and then you've lost all that sunk capital.
Does anybody disagree with that? Mr. Moeller, did you want to make an additional comment on that?
In the Midwest, with traditionally regulated states, the generation owners, in conjunction with their regulators, have committed to retrofitting 54,000 megawatts of the 66,000 megawatts on our system.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Van Wheely, let me ask you this, just because, as Mr. Dingell also pointed out, sometimes pipelines aren't so popular. That LNG storage facility just over the line in Canada, is there already a pipeline into the States?
Yes.
Okay.
There's a pipeline that comes.
Because we've had some difficulty getting the pipelines across the Canadian border of late, and just wouldn't want to see us running into that problem. I will tell you that I suspect that some of that natural gas comes out of a pool of natural gas that we've been trying to, in my home state of Virginia now since 2004, to get permission to explore and figure out what's out there. And many geologists have told us that natural gas the Canadians are getting offshore is in a pool that stretches all the way down to northern North Carolina, which covers a big chunk of Virginia in that patch. We would love to have you have a source of American natural gas from just offshore. If you don't want to do it in Massachusetts, we're glad to do it in Virginia.
We'd be happy to have you build a pipe. It would be great.
And we would love to create jobs for all Americans. Mr. Rush asked about minorities earlier, and we just think there's huge potential for not only the United States, but also for the Commonwealth of Virginia if we can get that permission. Mr. Chairman, that being said, this has been a great hearing, but I believe a lot of the questions that I would have asked have already been asked, and I will yield back.
Well, thanks, Griffith. This time, the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Goff, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Thank you to the witnesses for joining us today. Chairman Appel, just a couple of questions from your testimony and the experiences that we've shared. Could you talk a little bit about the long-term contracts that you mentioned, natural gas, and how does the ability to enter into long-term contracts help with certainty in pricing for utilities?
Thank you, Congressman. We could not have, developed Clean Air, Clean Jobs without a long-term contract. We had to take the volatility out. And so when we developed the program with the long-term contract, it just gave us that opportunity to have the smooth glide path for the next 10 years. And we don't anticipate any type of rate impact. In fact, we entered into a multi-year rate case with Public Service Company of Colorado with only a 5% increase in rates for the next 3 years.
And I believe it was Mr. Burgess from Texas who talked about just the differences between Colorado's unique needs, Texas's uniqueness, and just the variety of the states and the differences between the geography and mountains versus plains. And so when we came up with the solutions unique to Colorado, I think that's important. And you hear people talk about the stack solution, single stack solutions versus letting a state do a broader whole approach. And so I guess what I'm leading into is this: when you have a rule that allows you to make a decision for a state, that's a better way than individualizing, targeting specific sites. Is that correct?
I agree with you completely. It has to be a system benefit. If we did not look at the full suite of the older plants, the gas availability, including the energy efficiency opportunities, the program could not have gone forward.
And so Colorado's best equipped to make decisions for Colorado, just as Texas is best equipped to make decisions for Texas.
Well, I think the basic point is the West is the best, and I'd be pleased to brag about it, but absolutely.
I wholeheartedly agree with you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, and that's with the rest of to the point of allowing a holistic solution versus a stack specific. Would everybody else agree on the panel that that's the better way to proceed?
Yeah.
Thank you. And you talk a little bit about greenhouse gas reductions. You indicate in your testimony that greenhouse gas reductions must establish targets that are achievable through this suite of strategies tailored specifically to a state and in a state with vertically integrated utility or by a region in an organized market. Do you think that the proposals we see from this administration have done that?
You know, we have not yet seen the existing source rule, which to me is the critical rule that all of us are concerned about. I mean, clearly, in Colorado, we've addressed regional haze, at least for our investor-owned utilities, mercury or toxics. This is the biggest wild card. But I think if we have a sensible scope and sensible slope, actually, and length of time, it's manageable. But that really has to be, it'll have to be driven by the state once EPA or the Congress defines that goal.
And you talked a little bit about, in addition to the cooperation that we have in Colorado, we also had a very cooperative process on our regional haze issue and the SIP that we developed, bipartisan support. But we've seen now several groups in Colorado who have that chose not to participate in the process, despite its wide bipartisan support. Wild Earth Guardians, National Parks Conservation Association have sought to upend the process of the SIP that we got through bipartisan efforts. Through the PUC, do you support the Colorado Regional Haze SIP in its entirety?
Absolutely.
Yeah, and then if you agree, then you agree that the Department of Justice and EPA should defend the SIP in its entirety and should oppose modifications, which could be entering into a consent decree if that's what they would end up pursuing, that change the balanced approach agreed to by the diverse parties involved. You'd agree that the Department of Justice ought to defend the whole thing?
Well, I'm reluctant to ever tell the Department of Justice what to do, but I think Colorado did as fine a job as possible on regional haze, and clearly EPA supported it. I mean, they turned around the approval of our state implementation plan as quickly as possible. I mean, it's in record time.
And did this administration consult with Texas, Colorado? I'll ask all of you. Did the administration consult with your state before issuing rules like Utility MACT?
Not at all. Let me just add, Congressman, quickly, SO2, NOx, particulate matter, CO2 down to 1992 levels in Texas in the face of a growing economy without cap and trade.
Mr. Chairman Appel?
I'm not familiar with it.
I understand. Anybody else care to? Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. You'll back my time.
Well, thank you, Mr. Gardner, and thank all of you for your testimony. I think everyone agrees that the wild card is the CO2 regulations, and speaking for myself, all of this came about as a result of a Supreme Court decision, and there really has not been a national legislative debate on this issue. And something that we are going to be focused on is drafting some legislation in which we can have a national debate on it and let the legislative body decide. But the ramifications are big, the uncertainties are big, and we're going through great changes today. And so that's why we feel like this hearing is so important, and to hear from experts who are dealing with it in various ways. We appreciate that very much. And without objection, I would like to enter into the record the statement of our chairman, Fred Upton. And
Mr. Chairman, I just hope that and sincerely wish that, along with your plans for future hearings, I mean, you know how crazy I am about these hearings that we're holding. I wish you would also strongly consider a hearing where we'll have some scientists come in and discuss climate change.
Yeah, well, we've had a lot of hearings on climate change, that's for sure.
But no scientists.
Well, we've had, over the last 5 years, we've had 22-some hearings on climate change with scientists. But thank you for you and Mr. Waxman reminding us of that, and for the letter that you sent.
We certainly would like to hear
Thank you.
some scientists.
Thank you. Thank you all once again for being with us, and the record will remain open for 10 days. Some of you made commitments to provide additional information, and we look forward to working with all of you as we strive to meet the energy demands of our country and make sure we have adequate supply as well. Thank you. And with that, With that, the hearing is adjourned.